There is something moving through the night air when you listen closely enough. A low, almost imperceptible hum that seems to rise from the earth itself, from stone and clay and chalk, from the very bones of a landscape that has been holding its secrets for longer than memory reaches. Tonight we are going to walk together through that landscape. We are going to stand at the edges of things too old and too vast to have simple explanations. We are going to ask questions that archaeologists have been quietly arguing over for generations. Questions that have no clean answers, only deeper and more beautiful mysteries. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. There is a particular quality of silence that exists only in Britain on a night when the clouds have pulled back from the moon and the fields stretch away in every direction without a road or a street lamp to interrupt them. It is an ancient silence, not an empty one. The kind of silence that is full of something you cannot name. Farmers walking home across those fields in the dark for hundreds of years have felt it. Something watching from the hedgerows. Something patient and enormous just beneath the grass. They built walls and churches over it. They named their children after saints to keep it at a distance. And still it remains, still it breathes, still it waits at the edge of understanding, as it has waited since long before anyone thought to write anything down. We are talking tonight about structures that should not exist, about monuments built with a precision that makes no sense, given what we were supposed to know how to do, about earthworks and stone circles and carved hillsides and wooden temples that were raised by people we cannot name, using methods we have never fully reconstructed, in service of purposes we can only guess at. We are talking about a civilization, or perhaps several civilizations layered one atop the other, that built something on the island of Britain, so extraordinary, so technically demanding, so spatially interconnected, that if you were to see it laid out on a map all at once, your first response would be disbelief. And yet, the map does not lie. The stones are still there. The chalk is still there. The alignments still point at the same horizons they pointed at when the last hand pressed the last stone into place, and the last voice spoke whatever words were spoken. And the builders walked away, or did not walk away, or were swallowed by the centuries so completely that not a single name survived. Tonight we are going to try to understand them. We are going to move slowly. There is no hurry. The night is long, and the story is longer. We will begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can reach, and we will work our way forward through time, through layers of earth and chalk and meaning, until we arrive at the present moment and find, as we always do, that the present moment is simply the newest layer on top of everything that came before. Let your body settle. Let the weight of the day fall away. The questions we are asking are too old to be urgent. The people who built these things have already waited thousands of years to be understood. They can wait a little longer. We begin before Britain was an island. There was a time, not so very long ago in geological terms, when you could walk from what is now the east coast of England all the way to what is now Denmark. The North Sea did not exist as we know it. Instead, there was a vast and fertile plain, wide and low, crossed by rivers, populated by animals and trees, and almost certainly by people. Archaeologists have named this place Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank where fishing trawlers sometimes drag up the bones of mammoths and the tools of humans who lived and died there before the waters came. Doggerland was not a wasteland. It was not a frozen tundra or a hostile desert. It was rich lowland, threaded with rivers and wetlands, dense with the kind of biodiversity that draws large mammals and the people who follow them. Whoever lived there lived well. They fished the rivers, hunted the forests, gathered the roots and berries and seeds that the land offered in abundance. They built their shelters near the water, they buried their dead, and then, over the course of several thousand years, beginning around 12,000 years ago, the sea level rose, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as the ice sheets that had been holding enormous quantities of water in frozen reserve began to melt. The rivers that had crossed Doggerland became wider, and then merged, and then became arms of the sea. The forest that had covered it began to drown. The people who had lived there were pushed north and east and west, pushed onto higher ground, pushed eventually onto the island that would become Britain. We do not know what they carried with them. We do not know what knowledge they preserved, what stories they told about the world they had lost. But we know they arrived on the shores of what would become England and Wales and Scotland, and we know that some of them settled and some of them kept moving, and all of them began the long, slow process of learning a new landscape. This matters because it tells us something about the people who would eventually build the monuments we are going to explore tonight. They were not primitives stumbling into a world they did not understand. They were the inheritors of a tradition of landscape reading, of ecological knowledge, of spatial awareness that was old before their grandparents were born. The people who built Britain's great megastructures were descended from people who had lost a world to the sea and survived. That kind of loss does not make a people ignorant. It makes them careful. It makes them attentive. It makes them very, very good at reading the earth beneath their feet. The oldest built things in Britain are not what most people think of when they think of ancient monuments. They are not dramatic. They are not made of stone. They are made of wood, and they have vanished so completely that for a long time we did not even know they existed. It was only when the technology of aerial photography reached a sufficient level of refinement that we began to see them, and even then only as crop marks, faint discolorations in fields of wheat and barley, where the soil, enriched or depleted by structures long since rotted away, grows differently than the soil around it. The oldest of these wooden structures that we know about in Britain date to around 10,000 years ago. Mesolithic, in the archaeological vocabulary, meaning the Middle Stone Age. One of the most significant was found at a site called Starcar in Yorkshire, near what was then the shore of a large glacial lake. The people who lived at Starcar built a platform at the edge of the water, the earliest known worked timber construction in Europe, using worked logs that were split and shaped with a deliberateness that speaks of practiced skill. They also left behind the earliest known headdresses in Britain, made from the skulls and antlers of red deer, with the bone thinned and holes pierced through it so it could be worn. Worn for what purpose, we do not know. Ritual, perhaps, or hunting as a kind of disguise, or to mark status, or to channel something. The headdresses have the feeling of the sacred about them, though that word carries so much baggage from our own traditions that it may not mean quite what we think it means when applied to people living 10,000 years ago on the shores of a Yorkshire lake. What matters about Starcar is what it tells us about the level of intentionality these early people brought to the modification of their landscape. They did not simply camp at the edge of the water. They built into the edge of the water. They shaped it. They made it theirs. And this impulse, this need to inscribe human intention into the physical landscape, would only grow stronger over the centuries that followed. The revolution that changed everything came from elsewhere. We call it the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and it arrived in Britain from continental Europe somewhere around 6,000 years ago, carried by people who brought with them a new way of being in the world. They kept animals, they grew grain, they stayed in one place long enough to invest in it, long enough to build things that were meant to last, not just for a season or a lifetime, but for centuries, for the people who would come after. The first Neolithic farmers in Britain did not build stone circles. They built long mounds, enormous earthen structures raised by hand from the chalk and clay of the hillsides, sealed with massive stones, oriented toward the rising or setting of the sun or toward the dead, toward the lands of the dead as they understood them. We call them long barrows, though that name feels inadequate, feels too plain for what these things are when you stand beside one on a cold morning with the mist still in the valleys. Wayland's Smithy is one. It sits in Oxfordshire, beside the ancient Ridgeway path that runs along the chalk spine of the Berkshire Downs. The mound is about 50 metres long and 5 metres high, and it is older, we now believe, than anyone imagined when it was first excavated in the 19th century. Radiocarbon dating places the original construction at around 3,600 years before Christ. That means Wayland's Smithy was already ancient when the Egyptian pyramids were being planned. It was already a ruin of sorts, already being used in ways its builders had not originally intended when Stonehenge was in the first stages of its long construction. The name comes from later, from the Anglo-Saxon stories about a mythological blacksmith named Wayland who was said to live inside the mound and would reshoe your horse if you left it there overnight with a coin. This is what happens to very old things in a landscape. They accumulate stories. Each generation that passes by and finds them already incomprehensibly old adds its own layer of explanation, its own mythology, its own fear and reverence, until the original meaning is buried so deep beneath later meanings that excavation of the mind must accompany excavation of the earth. Inside Wayland's Smithy, the builders placed the dead. We know this because human bones were found when the site was excavated, though how many individuals were represented and over what period of time they were interred is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the monument was not simply a grave in the way we understand graves. It was something more complex, a place where the dead could be visited, perhaps consulted, perhaps appeased, a threshold between the world of the living and whatever world the builders believed lay beyond it. There are dozens of these long barrows scattered across the chalk downlands of southern England, dozens more in Wales and Scotland. Each one is a specific conversation between the people who built it and the landscape they inhabited, each one positioned with a care that suggests the builders understood the terrain around them with an intimacy we can only approximate today. About 40 kilometres west of Wayland's Smithy, also on the chalk, there is a place called Avebury. You may know the name. You may not know how extraordinary it is. Avebury is not simply a stone circle, it is the largest stone circle in the world. It is so large that an entire village exists inside it, with a pub and a church and a car park and houses, all enclosed within a circular earthen bank that is nearly 1.5 miles in circumference. The bank itself, and the ditch that runs inside it, required the movement of 200,000 tons of chalk rubble to construct. 200,000 tons, dug with antler picks and ox shoulder blades and human hands, carried in baskets to build a wall that rises in places to 15 meters above the bottom of the ditch. Inside this extraordinary enclosure, there were originally around 100 standing stones arranged in concentric circles. Many of them have been destroyed over the centuries, buried by medieval Christians who feared them, or broken up and used as building material by farmers who were more concerned with the practical than the symbolic. What remains is impressive enough. The stones at Avebury are sarsen, the same dense sandstone that was used at Stonehenge. Sarsens are not local to Avebury in the sense that they had to be quarried and brought there, but they are also not distant exotics. They come from the Marlborough Downs, a few miles to the north, scattered across the landscape in the way that sarsen stones occur naturally, as the remnants of an ancient sandstone cap that once covered much of the chalk hills and has since been eroded away. But the choice and arrangement of specific stones at Avebury was not random. The builders selected stones with deliberate attention to their shape, placing tall, thin stones and shorter, broader stones in alternating pairs in a pattern that some researchers believe represented male and female forms. The anthropomorphization of stone, the making of the earth itself into figures that could stand for something in the human imagination. Avebury was part of a much larger complex. Approaching from the south, you would have entered through Silbury Hill, the largest man-made mound in prehistoric Europe, a chalk pyramid that stands 40 meters high and covers about 5 acres at its base. It took an estimated 4 million hours of human labor to build. We do not know what it is for. Every theory that has been proposed has eventually broken down against the evidence. It is not a burial mound, though generations of archaeologists have dug into it, hoping to find a royal grave at its center, and found nothing. It is not a viewing platform, though it is tall enough to see for miles from its flattened summit. Its shape deliberately echoes the line of the hills around it, as if whoever designed it was making a conversation in 3 dimensions with the natural landscape. Beyond that, we are guessing. Approaching from the northeast, you would have come down the West Kennet Avenue, a ceremonial pathway lined on both sides by standing stones that stretches nearly 2 miles from the Avebury Circles to a place called the Sanctuary on Overton Hill, a now destroyed site of wooden and stone circles. Beyond the Sanctuary, another avenue once existed, though it has not survived. The scale of the Avebury complex is genuinely staggering when you try to comprehend it as a single unified landscape project. This was not a building. This was not even a village. This was the remaking of an entire section of landscape into something that functioned as a kind of living, breathing, seasonally activated text, readable by the people who understood its language, mysterious to those who did not. To understand how any of this was possible, we need to think about some things that modern life makes difficult to imagine: the relationship between people and place in the Neolithic. We are accustomed to a world in which our food comes from elsewhere, in which most of us move multiple times in our lives, in which the landscape around us is infrastructure rather than a relationship. The people who built Avebury did not experience the world this way. They had lived in their landscape for generations. Their grandparents had farmed these specific fields and tended these specific cattle and gathered these specific plants. Their knowledge of the land was not the abstract geographical knowledge of maps. It was the intimate, bodily, inherited knowledge of people who had touched every inch of it with their own hands, who had watched it change through every season, who had buried their dead in it and drawn their food from it and read the weather in it and understood its rhythms in ways we can barely imagine. When these people decided to build a monument, they were not making a random decision about where to put some stones. They were working within a landscape that was already saturated with meaning, with memory, with the accumulated experience of generations of careful attention. The placement of every stone, the orientation of every bank, the height of every mound was a response to something, a solstice alignment, a sightline to a significant natural feature, a memory of a spring that ran here, or a tree that once stood there, or a death that happened in this spot. We cannot recover those meanings now, but we can see the results of them in the extraordinary precision of the monuments themselves. Let us move north. Let us leave the chalk downs of Wiltshire and travel to Orkney, those windswept islands off the northern tip of Scotland, where the sea is never far away and the sky is enormous and grey, and the wind cuts through everything, regardless of how well you dress for it. Orkney, in late autumn or early winter, is one of the most desolate and beautiful places in the world, and it is home to a concentration of Neolithic monuments that has no parallel anywhere else in Britain. The heart of Neolithic Orkney, as it is formally designated by UNESCO, encompasses 4 main sites within a few miles of each other on the main island of Orkney. Skara is the best known, the underground stone village that was buried by sand for thousands of years, until a storm in 1850 uncovered it and revealed a settlement so perfectly preserved that you can still see the stone beds and the stone shelves and the stone hearths of the people who lived there, around 5,000 years ago. But Skara, remarkable as it is only one component of the Orcadian complex. Near the settlement, connected to it by the physical logic of the landscape, stands the Ring of Brodgar, a stone circle nearly 140 meters in diameter that was originally composed of 60 standing stones, of which about 27 remain. The Ring of Brodgar sits on a narrow strip of land between two lakes, with water on both sides, so that it appears to float between earth and water on certain mornings when the mist is low. A mile away stands the Stones of Stennes, older than the Ring of Brodgar by several centuries, its four remaining stones rising to extraordinary heights, one of them reaching nearly 6 meters, taller than a modern two-story house. And between these two circles, connecting them, there is the Barnhouse settlement, a village of stone houses whose inhabitants appear to have been the people who maintained and used these monuments over several generations. But it is a fourth site, discovered relatively recently, that has most dramatically changed our understanding of what Orkney was in the Neolithic. The Ness of Brodgar is a promontory of land between the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stennes. And for a long time it was overlooked because it looked like nothing more than a low ridge of ground. Excavations that began in 2003 and are still ongoing have revealed beneath that ridge a complex of structures unlike anything else known from the Neolithic world. There is a massive stone-walled enclosure, nearly 100 meters on its longest side, with walls in some places, standing to 1.5 meters of preserved height, built with a skill that archaeologists describing it tend to reach instinctively for superlatives. Inside the enclosure, there are buildings, many of them densely packed and architecturally ambitious in ways that force the term temple into the vocabulary, even of researchers who would rather avoid it. One structure, designated Building 5, has walls that are 4 meters thick. 4 meters. This is not a building designed for domestic habitation. This is a building designed to communicate something, to embody something, to last. The painted walls of the Ness of Brodgar are perhaps the most startling discovery. Geometric patterns in red and yellow ochre, applied to stone surfaces inside the buildings, speak of a visual culture that was sophisticated and intentional, and that operated according to a symbolic grammar we have not yet decoded. Dozens of decorated stone objects have been found at the site. Carved stone balls, incised with geometric patterns so precise that their production required sustained skill and practice. Carved stone plaques, items that speak of specialization, of people who did nothing else but make these things, who were fed and housed and protected so that they could make these things. What was the Ness of Brodgar? The working theory is that it was a ceremonial center of some kind, a place where people came from considerable distances to participate in rituals or festivals or exchanges that reinforced the social bonds that kept a dispersed agricultural population coherent. Evidence of feasting on a genuinely extraordinary scale has been found at the site. The bones of hundreds of cattle slaughtered and consumed. This is not a family gathering. This is an event, something that drew people from far away and fed them abundantly and sent them home with the memory of it. The final act of the Ness of Brodgar, as far as archaeologists can determine, was equally extraordinary. When the site was eventually abandoned, somewhere around 2300 BCE, it was deliberately and systematically demolished. The buildings were filled with rubble, the roofs were brought down, and on top of the whole assemblage, the bones of at least 400 cattle were deposited. A massive closing feast, a kind of ceremony of ending that suggests the abandonment of this place was not a crisis or a desertion, but a planned, meaningful conclusion to whatever this place had been. You do not close a site with that kind of deliberate ritual unless the site itself meant something profound to you, unless the ending of it needed to be marked with the same care as everything that had happened within it. The same centuries that saw the construction of the Ness of Brodgar saw the beginning, the very first stirring of what would become the most famous prehistoric monument in the world. Stonehenge did not arrive suddenly. It was built in stages over the course of more than 1,000 years, and each stage tells us something different about the people who built it and the purposes they were pursuing. The earliest phase of Stonehenge, dating to around 3000 BCE, was not a stone circle at all. It was a circular earthwork, a bank, and a ditch, very similar in basic form to the Avebury enclosure. Inside the ditch, a series of holes were dug and then deliberately filled, presumably with wooden posts that have long since vanished. These are the Aubrey holes, named after the 17th century antiquary John Aubrey, who first recorded them, and they are the oldest component of the Stonehenge we can trace. Some of the Aubrey holes contained cremated human remains, suggesting that from its very first phase, this was a place where the dead were brought and where something was done with them that required this particular spot, this particular alignment, this particular relationship between the earth and the sky. Phase 2, beginning around 2600 BCE, brought the first stones. And here, the story becomes strange in ways that still make archaeologists uncomfortable, because the first stones to be raised at Stonehenge were the blue stones. 80 of them, each one weighing somewhere between 2 and 5 tons, and each one quarried from outcrops in the Preseli Hills of West Wales. Wales, 250 miles away, across the Bristol Channel, through river valleys and over hills and through dense forest. 250 miles of difficult terrain, and the people who built Stonehenge moved 80 stones of between 2 and 5 tons each across every mile of it. This is not a simple feat of logistics. Moving 5-ton stones 250 miles in the Neolithic, without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without large draft animals capable of the kind of sustained pulling that would be required, is an achievement that demands explanation. And the explanations that archaeologists have offered, timber sledges, rollers, boats along the coast, controlled experiments demonstrating that it can be done with enough people and enough effort, are all plausible in principle, while remaining slightly unsatisfying in practice. Because the question is not really whether these movements were physically possible. Of course they were, or the stones would not be there. The question is why. Why drag 80 stones 250 miles when you are surrounded by perfectly good, local stone? The answer, or part of it, is beginning to emerge from recent research at the Preseli Hills themselves. Quarrying sites have been identified at 2 locations, Carn Godog and Rosifellin, and the evidence from these sites suggests that the bluestones were not simply the closest available material that happened to be brought to Stonehenge by some coincidence of prehistoric logistics. They were specifically chosen from these specific places, and those specific places appear to have already been sacred sites before the stones were moved. There are traces of human activity at both quarrying sites that predate the main Stonehenge construction phases. The stones may have been brought to Stonehenge, not because they were physically useful, but because they were already powerful, already charged with meaning, already associated with ceremonies or beliefs that the builders of Stonehenge wanted to bring with them when they made this place. This is a very different way of thinking about the monument, not as an engineering achievement, though it is certainly that, but as a gathering together of sacred things from across a landscape, a centralization of power, physical and symbolic, into a single place. The bluestones from Wales, the sarsen, trilithons from the Marlborough Downs, the heelstone and the slaughter stone and the altar stone, each with its own origin, its own story, its own contribution to the larger argument that Stonehenge was making, to the sky and to the earth and to the people who gathered there. The great sarsen trilithons are the final and most dramatic phase of construction, beginning around 2500 BCE. Each trilithon consists of 2 enormous upright stones and a horizontal lintel stone laid across the top of them, and the technical achievement of lifting those lintels into position and keeping them there for 4,500 years required a sophistication of structural knowledge that we are still working to fully understand. The lintels are not simply balanced on top of the uprights. They are connected to them by mortise and tenon joints. The same jointing technique used in woodworking, transposed into stone with a precision that astonishes every stonemason who examines it. And the tops of the uprights are not flat. They are slightly convex, curved outward to compensate for the visual distortion that makes horizontal surfaces look lower in the middle when viewed from a distance. This is the same technique used by the architects of the Parthenon in Athens, and it tells you that the builders of Stonehenge were thinking in 3 dimensions with a sophistication that the word primitive simply does not accommodate. There is something I want you to notice about everything we have discussed so far. The Long Barrows, the Avebury complex, the Ness of Brodgar, Stonehenge. These are not isolated monuments. They are nodes in a network. They are connected to each other and to dozens of other sites across the British landscape, by lines of sight, by paths, by rivers, by astronomical alignments, by the movement of animals, by the movement of people through a landscape that was being actively organized around them. The Ridgeway, that ancient chalk path along the Berkshire and Wiltshire Downs, connects sites that span thousands of years of occupation. The Icknield Way, running northeast from the Ridgeway toward Norfolk, follows a route so old that its origins are genuinely uncertain. These are not Roman roads or medieval trackways. They are paths that were already ancient when the Romans arrived and found them still in use. Paths that follow the ridges and the dry high ground, where travel was possible, even in winter, where visibility was good and danger could be seen approaching, where the chalk lay near the surface and the ground did not turn to mud with every rainfall. Along these ancient ways, monument after monument was placed. Not randomly, not by separate groups of people making independent decisions about where to put their sacred places, but in conversation with each other, each new monument aware, in the minds of its builders, of what had already been built, of what alignments already existed, of what the landscape was already saying, and what new things needed to be added to complete the sentence. This network of monuments and pathways suggests not a series of isolated communities each doing their own thing, but something more unified, a shared tradition of landscape thinking, shared across large distances, maintained across many generations, sophisticated enough to be consistent even as it evolved and changed over centuries. Let us talk for a moment about the people who built these things. We tend to imagine them as simple, as limited, as struggling at the very edge of what human ingenuity could accomplish. This is our failure of imagination, not a reflection of their capabilities. The Neolithic farmers of Britain were the products of thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge. They knew the plants and animals of their landscape with a depth of understanding that modern biologists have spent careers trying to approach. They understood the sky with an intimacy that required no instruments beyond careful observation, maintained across many generations. They knew the properties of stone and wood and clay and fiber with the practical certainty of people who had been working with these materials all their lives. And they could organize. This is perhaps the thing that is hardest for us to grasp, because we tend to think of complex social organization as something that requires writing, or cities, or bureaucracy, or all the other machinery of what we call civilization. But Stonehenge required the coordination of thousands of people over hundreds of years without any of those things. The Ness of Brodgar required a stable and sophisticated social order capable of sustaining a specialized labor force over decades, capable of feeding and housing the people who did no farming, but instead built walls 4 meters thick and decorated them with painted geometric patterns. Silbury Hill required 4 million hours of organized human labor. These achievements are not possible without social complexity. They are not possible without what we might reasonably call a civilization, even if it does not look like the civilizations we usually identify by that name, even if it left no texts, no cities, no coinage, no inscriptions. The evidence of it is written in stone and chalk and earth in structures of such scale and precision that their construction demands we revise our assumptions about what was possible in this period. One of the most extraordinary aspects of British prehistoric monuments is the degree to which they demonstrate an understanding of astronomy that we did not believe existed in the Neolithic until we started looking carefully at the alignments. The summer solstice sunrise at Stonehenge is famous. Every year on the longest day, the sun rises above the heelstone and its light falls down the main avenue of the monument and illuminates the altar stone at the centre. This alignment has been known for a long time. What is less well known is that Stonehenge also aligns with the midwinter sunset, that the axis of the monument works in both directions, and that the midwinter alignment may have been the more significant of the two. The moment when the sun reaches its furthest point south and begins to return, the moment that guarantees the world will not stay dark forever. But the astronomical knowledge embedded in British prehistoric monuments goes far beyond simple solstice alignments. The Callanish stone circle on the Isle of Lewis in the Scottish Outer Hebrides demonstrates a relationship with the moon that is far more complex and took far longer to understand. Once every 18.61 years, the moon reaches the southernmost point of its rising arc, an event astronomers call the major lunar standstill. At Callanish, during this event, the moon appears to skim along the southern horizon, setting temporarily behind the hills in a pattern that makes it appear to enter and then leave the stone circle. This is an event that requires not just casual observation, but systematic, careful, multi-generational tracking of the lunar cycle to predict. And the builders of Callanish appear to have understood it well enough to orient their stones around it. The monument at Callanish is itself strikingly beautiful in a way that photographs do not fully communicate. 49 stones arranged in a circle with 4 avenues of stones radiating from it, one to the north that is much longer than the others, creating the effect of a cross within a circle when viewed from above. The stones themselves are grey Lewisian gneiss, one of the oldest rock formations on Earth, nearly 3 billion years old. The people who placed them did so around 5,000 years ago. The stones are, in a meaningful sense, among the oldest things that human hands have ever touched. There is another tradition of monument building in Britain that is less celebrated than the stone circles, but no less extraordinary. The wooden henge. Henges, in the technical archaeological sense, are circular earthworks with an internal ditch, and they were built in large numbers across Britain in the late Neolithic, most of them never receiving any stone at all, instead hosting arrangements of timber posts that were raised, used, and eventually left to rot. Woodhenge, a mile and a half northeast of Stonehenge, is one of the best preserved examples. It was discovered by aerial photography in 1925, when the parch marks of its timber circles appeared in a field of wheat during a dry summer, and when excavated, it revealed 6 concentric rings of posts. The outer ones enormous, large enough to have held posts 3 meters in diameter. At the center of Woodhenge, a child was buried, the skull deliberately split. This detail stops the breath. Whatever it means, whatever ceremony or sacrifice or offering it represents, it tells us that the people who use this place took it seriously in ways that cost something profound. Even more dramatic is the monument known as the Durrington Walls, a few hundred meters from Woodhenge. Durrington Walls is the largest henge in Britain, its bank enclosing an area of nearly 30 hectares. Inside, 2 large circles of massive timber posts were raised, and around these circles there was a settlement. Dozens of houses, evidence of feasting on a scale consistent with large seasonal gatherings, a midden, a rubbish dump of bone and pottery, and flint that has been analysed and shows that people were coming here from considerable distances and bringing their livestock with them. Durrington Walls and Stonehenge are connected by an ancient avenue that runs down to the River Avon, and recent research has suggested that this connection was not accidental. Stonehenge was a place of the dead, receiving cremated remains and memorializing ancestors. Dorrington Walls was a place of the living, hosting the great seasonal feasts and ceremonies. The river connected them, and the processing of the dead through the water from one place to the other may have been part of the ritual logic that gave the whole complex its meaning. What strikes me, when I think about all of this, is how it resists the simple narratives we like to tell about the past. This was not a primitive people stumbling toward civilization. This was a sophisticated culture with its own architecture, its own astronomy, its own philosophy of landscape and death and community, operating at a scale and with a degree of organization that was not matched again in Britain until the construction of the great medieval cathedrals. And the great medieval cathedrals had cranes and metal tools and a literate class of architects who could write down what they planned to build. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1999 on the beach at Home Next the Sea in Norfolk. A timber circle was exposed by the tide, a ring of 55 oak posts encircling a single massive, upturned oak stump at its center, its roots pointing skyward. Preserved for 4,000 years in the waterlogged peat of what had once been a salt marsh. It was nicknamed Stonehenge, though that name is misleading in all kinds of ways, and its discovery provoked one of the most intense debates in British archaeology of the past 30 years. Not just about what the monument was and meant, but about who it belonged to, who had the right to excavate it, who had the right to preserve it, and whether preservation itself was the right thing to do. The Stonehenge timbers were radiocarbon dated to around 2049 BCE, and the dendrochronology, the tree ring analysis, was precise enough to show not just the year, but the season in which the trees were felled. Spring. They were cut in spring of 2049 BCE, and the tool marks on the timbers showed that at least 50 different axes were used in the fellings and shaping of the posts, which implies at least 50 people participated in the work, perhaps more, bringing their tools from their own communities to contribute to something that required collective effort. The upturned stump at the center is the most mysterious element. Inverting something, placing it upside down, is a reversal. In folklore and magic traditions around the world, reversal is associated with the world of the dead, with the passage between realms, with things being done backwards, so they take effect in an inverted reality. Was the upturned stump at Stonehenge a symbol of this kind? Was it a platform for the exposure of a body, as some have suggested, a high place where flesh could be removed by birds and elements before bones were gathered for burial? Was it an axis mundi, a world tree, placed with its roots in the sky and its crown in the earth to indicate a cosmic inversion? We do not know. The monument was removed from the beach and preserved in a museum after considerable controversy. A second circle was later found a few meters away, with a split oak log at its center, also well preserved, also oriented in ways that suggest careful astronomical attention. The beach at Home Next the Sea has not yet given up all its secrets. We should talk about the chalk. The chalk is fundamental to understanding the kind of ancient landscape art that exists in southern England. Art so enormous that it is only visible from the air or from distant hillsides. Art that in some cases has been maintained for so long that we cannot be certain when it was first created. The White Horse of Uffington on the Berkshire Downs is the oldest of the chalk figures, cut into the steep scarp of the hill at a point so high and at such an angle that it can only be fully seen from the air or from several miles away across the vale of the White Horse below. It is an abstract creature, sinuous and strange, not like any horse that has ever lived. Its body, a series of flowing lines that suggest speed and power without depicting them literally. A horse as the idea of a horse as it feels to see one running, rather than as it looks to observe one standing still. The White Horse of Uffington was dated using optical luminescence to around 1000 BCE, which is far more recent than its nearest great monument neighbours, but it may have replaced something earlier, The hill on which it was cut, Dragon Hill as it is known, has a flat, artificial-looking summit, and local legend associates it with St. George slaying the dragon, a story that is obviously a medieval overlay on something much older. The vale below it, the Vale of the White Horse, takes its name from the figure on the hill, and the name is old enough that it appears in documents from the 11th century, which means the horse was already significant, already named, already integrated into the landscape mythology of the region, before the Normans arrived. Each year, or so the old customs prescribed, the local community would gather to scour the horse, to clean out the chalk and keep the figure white and visible against the green hill. This practice of scouring was a festival, accompanied by games and feasting, and it continued until at least the 19th century. The community maintained the horse not because anyone told them to, not because any authority required it, but because it was theirs, because it belonged to them and they to it, in the way that a landscape feature that has been attended and cared for across many generations becomes part of the identity of the people who tend it. There is something deeply moving about this. A figure cut into a hillside 3,000 years ago, maintained by ordinary people who came together year after year to keep it visible, who built a festival around the work of its maintenance, who passed the tradition down to their children and their grandchildren across 100 generations. The horse outlasted the civilization that created it. It outlasted the Roman occupation. It outlasted the Anglo-Saxon migrations and the Viking raids and the Norman conquest and the Black Death and the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. It is still there, still white against the green, still visible for miles. The Cerne Abbas, giant in Dorset, is a different kind of chalk figure and a more controversial one. A giant male figure, 180 feet tall, carved into the chalk hillside north of the village of Cerne Abbas. Holding a knotted club and exhibiting an explicit physical vigor that has made him the source of local legends and tourist photographs for as long as anyone can remember. The question of when the Cerne giant was made is genuinely unresolved. Proponents of great antiquity argue that he represents a pre-Roman deity, possibly Hercules, possibly something more local and more ancient. Skeptics point out that the first documentary reference to the figure dates only to the 17th century and suggest he may be a political satire of Oliver Cromwell, created during the Civil War period. Recent optical luminescence, dating of samples taken from the figure's outline, suggested a date somewhere between 700 and 1100 CE, which, if accurate, would place the giant's creation in the late Iron Age or early medieval period, not the Neolithic. But the question is complicated by the fact that the giant may have been allowed to become overgrown at some point and then recut later, so that the dating of the current outline does not necessarily reflect the date of the original creation. What is clear is that he is very old, that the landscape around him has been organized in relation to him for a very long time, and that local people have treated him with the same mixture of reverence and affectionate propriety that the White Horse receives in Uffington. Above the giant, on the hilltop, there is an earthwork enclosure called the Trendle, thought to be an Iron Age feature, and local tradition associated it with the celebration of May Day, with dances and festivities around the maypole that linked the fertility of the land with the imposing figure below. I want to stop here and ask a question that does not have a comfortable answer. What happened to the people who built all of this? The Neolithic civilization that raised the great monuments of Britain did not simply evolve into the Bronze Age civilization that followed it. Recent ancient DNA analysis of human remains from Britain has revealed something far more dramatic. Around 2400 BCE, the genetic profile of the British population changed almost completely, almost within a few generations. The people who had been building stone circles and wooden temples and great chalk enclosures for 1500 years were replaced or overwhelmed or absorbed by incoming people from continental Europe, people associated with what archaeologists call the bell beaker culture. named for a distinctive style of pottery that spread across Europe with remarkable speed. These bell beaker people were genetically quite different from the people they replaced. They came ultimately from the Pontic steppe, the great grassland east of the Black Sea, the same region from which the Indo-European languages spread. By 2000 BCE, the genetic analysis suggests, the population of Britain was 90% descended from these newcomers and only 10% descended from the people who had built Stonehenge. This is one of the most dramatic population replacements in prehistoric Europe, and it happened, as far as we can tell, without any obvious evidence of mass violence, without the archaeological signature of conquest and destruction that we might expect if it was a sudden military event. It may have been gradual, a slow process of movement and intermarriage and demographic shift spread over several generations, or it may have been faster than that. We do not know. What we do know is that the monument survived. Stonehenge continued to be used, to be modified, to be expanded by the incoming bell beaker people and then by their successors. The White Horse continued to be scoured. The long barrows continued to be visited. The new people inherited the landscape that the old people had made and made it their own, adding to it, interpreting it, changing its meanings over time, but not erasing it. You do not erase something you do not understand. You tend it and wonder at it and build your own stories around it. The Bronze Age in Britain, from roughly 2500 to 800 BCE, saw a continuation and a transformation of the tradition of monumental landscape making. Stone circles continued to be built, though increasingly they were smaller and more local than the great Neolithic complexes, expressions of community identity and seasonal ritual, rather than large-scale regional projects. Bronze Age barrows, round rather than long, were raised in their thousands across the British landscape, accumulating on hilltops and ridges in groups that sometimes number in the dozens. The burial places of a new elite that marked its status with grave goods of bronze and gold and amber and faience that had travelled to Britain from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The gold of the Bronze Age elite is extraordinary. The Rillaton gold cup, found in a barrow on Bodmin Moor, is made with a sophistication of goldsmithing that astonishes specialists even now. The Bush Barrow Man, buried near Stonehenge around 1900 BCE, was interred with objects of such wealth and craftsmanship that he is often described as a paramount chief or a king, though we should be careful about imposing our own political categories onto social structures we cannot directly observe. Among his grave goods was a lozenge of sheet gold, so precisely cut and decorated that when researchers subjected it to geometric analysis, they found that its proportions encoded significant mathematical relationships. Whether this was intentional or an artifact of the decorative style is debated, but the possibility that it was intentional is unsettling in the best possible way. There is a site in the Orkney Islands that I have not yet mentioned and that deserves its own careful consideration. It is called Maeshowe, and it is a chambered cairn, a burial monument that was built around 2800 BCE. From the outside, it appears to be simply a large grassy mound, approximately 7 meters high and 30 meters in diameter, surrounded by a flat platform that was artificially created around it. You would not look at it and immediately understand why it is considered one of the finest architectural achievements of prehistoric Europe. You have to go inside to understand. The entrance passage is about 11 meters long and just wide enough to walk through, without turning sideways if you are not too broad-shouldered. As you move down it, your footsteps grow quiet, the sound absorbed by the stone around you, and then you emerge into a central chamber that is tall enough to stand in comfortably and large enough for a small group of people, lined with flat stone slabs fitted together with a precision that would satisfy a modern, dry stone wall builder. The chamber is not the extraordinary thing, though it is beautifully made. The extraordinary thing is what happens inside it at the winter solstice. For 3 weeks, around the shortest day of the year, the setting sun aligns exactly with the entrance passage and sends a beam of golden light all the way down its length and onto the rear wall of the central chamber. The light illuminates the chamber completely for a brief period each afternoon, a moment of warmth and brilliance in the depths of a northern winter. This alignment was not accidental. To build an entrance passage 11 meters long that precisely targets the winter solstice sunset from a location where you can see that sunset required careful planning, extended observation, and a degree of astronomical knowledge that we are still in the process of properly understanding. The builders of my show understood where the sun set at the solstice, and they built a chamber around that knowledge, so that for one brilliant moment each year the darkness inside was broken by light, so that even the dead, even the bones, and the memories stored within the cairn were touched by the returning sun. The Viking Age added its own unexpected footnote to the story of my show. Sometime in the 12th century, a group of Norsemen broke into the cairn and sheltered inside during a storm, and they left behind what amounts to a collection of graffiti on the walls of the chamber, the largest collection of Norse runic inscriptions outside Scandinavia. 30 different hands carved 30 different messages into the stone, a combination of boasting, poetry, reports of treasure, and the kind of casual commentary that people make when they find themselves unexpectedly in an unexpected place with time on their hands. One of the inscriptions reads, "These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes in the Western Ocean." Another says simply, "Ingebjorg the fair widow." Many of them refer to treasure, suggesting that the Norsemen believed the mound contained gold, which it may well have done before earlier raiders helped it themselves. And several of them comment on the monument itself, on the fact that it was made by people called Lothbrok's sons, a legendary attribution, the Norse equivalent of saying it must have been built by giants because ordinary people could not have done this. This too is part of the story. The way that each generation that encounters these ancient things, too old to be placed in any familiar history, reaches for the vocabulary of the supernatural to explain them. Giants, gods, magic. The builders must have had powers beyond human capacity, because if they were ordinary humans, what does that say about the smallness of our own ordinary lives? Now let me take you somewhere unexpected. Let me take you out of the familiar landscape of chalk and sarsen and Orcadian gneiss, and into the uplands of Wales, into the mountains of the Brecon Beacons and the Black Mountains, and the long ridges of mid-Wales where the wind is always moving, and the sheep outnumber the people, and the sense of deep, immovable antiquity is stronger than anywhere else on these islands. The stone circles of Wales are not as famous as their counterparts in England and Scotland, but they are numerous and they are extraordinary. Cerrig Duon in the Brecon Beacons, a modest oval of standing stones in a valley that feels entirely isolated from the modern world, surrounded by mountains. Lyn y Fan, Fash, the lake where a fairy woman rose from the water and married a mortal farmer and taught his descendants the healing arts that made them famous physicians for generations. The lakes and the stones are woven together in the Welsh landscape in ways that resist separation. The Prehistoric hills of Pembrokeshire, from which the bluestones of Stonehenge were quarried, are themselves remarkable. The hills are dominated by a ridge of exposed rocky ground, the Carn Mani, and it is here that the bluestones were taken, from places where they were already surrounded by smaller stones, in arrangements that suggest existing sacred sites. The landscape of the Prehistoric is punctuated by standing stones and ring cairns and the tracks of ancient paths, and the whole assemblage creates the feeling of a landscape that was, for thousands of years, deeply and continuously inhabited in a sacred as well as a practical sense. The long-distance path from the Preseli Hills to Stonehenge, which recent researchers have proposed, may have been an ancient processional route, passes through a landscape that has monuments along almost its entire length, as if the people who moved the bluestones were not simply taking a practical transport route, but were following a sacred geography, moving from one marked place to the next, along a line inscribed in the landscape by generations of their predecessors. Somewhere around 1000 BCE, something changes. The great tradition of communal monument building that had defined British prehistory for 2000 years begins to shift. The stone circles stop being built in significant numbers. The emphasis moves from communal funerary monuments to something more dispersed, more individualized, more concerned with the organization of agricultural land than with the alignment of the living and the dead with the movements of the heavens. This is the Iron Age, or the approach to it, and the Iron Age brings with it a different kind of monumental architecture. The hill fort. Hundreds of hill forts dot the British landscape, from the vast multi-vallet enclosures of the southwest to the smaller, more numerous sites of Wales and the north. They are not simply defensive structures, though they were clearly capable of serving a defensive function. They are statements of territory and identity, places where communities gathered for exchange and ceremony and the management of livestock, organized around ramparts and ditches that required substantial collective labor to construct and maintain. Maiden Castle in Dorset is the largest hill fort in Europe, a complex of concentric earthen ramparts enclosing 47 acres on a hill overlooking the Vale of Blackmore. Walking its ramparts is a physical experience of the landscape that nothing can substitute for. The sense of being raised above the ordinary level of things, of having the world spread out below you in all directions, of understanding why this hill was chosen and why it was worth the enormous effort of building these defenses around it. But the hill forts are not the most mysterious of the Iron Age monuments. The most mysterious are the souterrains and fogus, underground passages associated with Iron Age settlements, often lined with carefully laid stone. Their purpose, so unclear that modern archaeologists continue to debate it. Storage, obviously. The cool underground environment was practical for the preservation of dairy and meat. But many fogus have features that suggest purposes beyond simple refrigeration. They are connected to the settlements above them in complex and deliberate ways. They are oriented. They are not just holes in the ground. The Halligai Fogu in Cornwall is one of the best preserved. A passage 27 meters long with a side chamber, dug into the ground and lined with dry stone walling. The main passage is high enough to walk through, the side chamber lower and narrower and darker, requiring you to crouch as you move into it. The experience of being inside a fogu is unlike anything else in the British archaeological landscape. The sound changes, the temperature changes. The sense of the world above becomes distant and then absent. You are inside the earth in a way that feels intentional, purposeful, arranged for a reason that has something to do with the relationship between the people who use this place and the underground, the dark, the preserved and hidden things. The Romans arrived in 43 CE and found a landscape already old beyond their imagining. They were not, by and large, destroyers of that landscape. They were pragmatists who used what was useful and ignored what was not. The roads they built ran on ancient lines in many cases, following the routes that generations of feet had already worn into the land. The towns they founded were often established near existing centres of population and exchange. And the great monuments, the stone circles and the hill forts and the long barrows, they left alone, treating them with the wary respect that one civilization tends to accord the incomprehensible achievements of another. Roman soldiers stationed in Britain wrote home about the temples and sacred places they found here. The Druids, the priestly class of Celtic Britain, were objects of fascination and fear in equal measure, described by Roman writers with a combination of horrified disapproval and grudging awe. The Roman assault on Anglesey in 60 CE, described by Tacitus as a scene of extraordinary drama, with druids calling down curses from the shore and women in black running among the warriors, was not simply a military operation. It was an attempt to destroy a center of religious and political power that the Romans recognized as genuinely dangerous to their occupation. The sacred groves and the holy wells and the great monuments survived the Roman occupation, as they had survived everything that came before. The Romans built Hadrian's Wall across the north of England, the most dramatic monument of their occupation, and they built it partly along a line that was already significant in the landscape, already marked by earthworks and settlements and boundaries. The wall did not create a division in the British landscape. It formalized one that was already there. Here is a detail that I find impossible to forget once you have learned it. In 2015, archaeologists working near Stonehenge discovered, buried in the chalk beneath what appeared to be an ordinary part of the landscape, a series of massive pits arranged in a circle approximately 5 kilometers in diameter, centered on the Dorrington Wall's henge. The pits were enormous, some of them up to 5 meters deep and 10 meters across. There were at least 20 of them, and possibly more beyond the surveyed area. They were not natural. They had been dug by people, or more precisely, they appeared to have been created by people, removing enormous deposits of material from them. These are the largest prehistoric monuments discovered in Britain in living memory, and they were found not by excavation, but by a technique called ground-penetrating radar, which can detect anomalies beneath the surface without lifting a single spade. The technology that allows us to see these things without destroying them is relatively new, and its application to the landscape around Stonehenge has been transforming our understanding of the complexity of that landscape faster than any previous period of research. What were these enormous pits for? Some researchers have suggested they were boundary markers, defining the edge of a sacred area centered on Dorrington walls. Others have proposed that they were part of a processional circuit, that people walked or processed around the circumference of this circle of pits in the performance of seasonal ceremonies. The pits themselves have been backfilled with chalk, as if something that was in them was removed, as if the action of digging them was itself the significant thing, or as if what was placed in them was taken out again for use elsewhere. This is the nature of the Stonehenge landscape. Every generation of archaeologists that works here discovers things that rewrite what we thought we understood. The ground is full of monuments we have not yet found. The sky above it is full of alignments we have not yet decoded. The story is not finished. It may never be finished. There is something I need to tell you about a site called Thornborough in North Yorkshire, because Thornborough is one of the great hidden monuments of Britain, known to specialists and almost no one else. Despite being arguably one of the most significant prehistoric sites in the country, the Thornborough Henges are 3 enormous circular earthworks arranged in a line across the Vale of Mowbray, each about 240 meters in diameter, spaced about 550 meters apart, and oriented in a way that, when viewed from above, mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt. The alignment with Orion was noted by researcher Aubrey Burl decades ago and has been further developed by others since. Orion was a significant constellation in many ancient cultures, associated with the dead, with the afterlife, with the turning of the year. Whether the Thornborough builders specifically intended to mirror Orion in their henge placement, or whether the alignment is a coincidence or an artifact of the natural topography, is genuinely disputed. What is not disputed is the scale of the Thornborough complex. Each henge required the movement of enormous quantities of earth, and the 3 together represent a major landscape project. More remarkably, the banks of the Thornborough henges were covered with gypsum, a white mineral that would have made them gleam in sunlight and moonlight, visible from great distances, announcing the presence of this sacred place to anyone approaching across the flat vale. Gypsum is not a natural surface material in the area. It was collected and transported specifically to coat these banks. The builders wanted them to shine. Near Thornborough, other monuments complete a complex that has been described as the Stonehenge of the North, though that comparison perhaps undersells both places. There are cursus monuments, long parallel earthworks that appear to have been processional routes. There are further henges. There are stone settings that have largely been destroyed by centuries of quarrying for building material. The Vale of Mowbray is not, in most people's mental geography of prehistoric Britain, a significant landscape. It should be. I want to spend some time with the cursus monuments because they are among the strangest and least understood of all the prehistoric structures in the British landscape. A cursus is a long, parallel-sided enclosure defined by banks and ditches, typically running for hundreds of meters and sometimes for several kilometers, wide enough that if you stood at one end, you could not see the other, oriented with a care that has attracted the attention of archaeologists interested in astronomical alignments. The Stonehenge cursus, running north of Stonehenge itself, is nearly 3 kilometers long and about 150 meters wide, defined by banks that were originally about 1.5 meters high. It predates the stone circles of Stonehenge by several centuries. Its purpose is unknown. Roman antiquarians, when they first began to study these long earthworks, assumed they were racecourses, which is where the Latin name comes from. But this explanation has been thoroughly abandoned. They are not racecourses. They may be processional routes, corridors through which people moved from one point to another in the performance of ceremonies or seasonal rituals. They may be symbolic boundaries between different kinds of space, the living and the dead, the sacred and the profane, the world above and the world below. They may have been used for communal gatherings in ways we have not yet imagined. The longest cursus monument in Britain, the Dorset Cursus, runs for nearly 10 kilometres across the chalk downland of Cranbourne Chase, passing near a series of long barrows that appear to have been incorporated into its design, as if the monument was built to include and reference the places where the dead were buried. Walking along a cursus monument, even a partially preserved one, is a strange experience. The banks on either side reduce your field of vision, narrowing your view of the landscape to a strip of sky above you and the ground immediately ahead. You are enclosed, directed, your movement constrained by the earthwork in a way that feels intentional, that feels like it is meant to do something to you, to change how you experience space, to create a different kind of awareness in the body as it moves through this shaped and bounded corridor. The tradition of building in Britain did not simply stop with the Romans and resume with the Normans. The centuries between those events saw the continuation of a monumental tradition in a different key. The great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms raised halls and churches and boundary earthworks. Offa's Dyke, the enormous bank and ditch built along the Welsh border by the Mercian king Offa in the 8th century, is a feat of earth-moving comparable in scale to many prehistoric earthworks. Running for 240 kilometres across difficult terrain, with a consistency that required centralised planning and management. The long barrows and stone circles and carved chalk figures that survived into the Anglo-Saxon period were interpreted within a new mythology. They were the work of giants, of demons, of the people who had lived here before the English came, remembered only in fragmentary stories, in place names that preserved the echoes of languages no longer spoken, in landscapes that still bore the marks of the hands that had shaped them. And the churches. The early English Christian church has a complex relationship with the prehistoric landscape that we have barely begun to fully understand. Archaeologists have long noted that many medieval churches sit within circular churchyards that appear to predate the Christian building at their centre. The circular churchyard at Ysbyty Cynfyn in Wales, to take one example, incorporates 5 standing stones from what was clearly a prehistoric stone circle. The church built inside the circle, the stones left standing as boundary markers. This is not an exceptional case. It is a pattern. the church built where the old sacred place already was, the new meaning growing from the root of the old one, the congregation gathering at the same spot their ancestors had gathered for thousands of years. The reasons changed, but the place unchanged. Among the most beautiful and least visited prehistoric sites in Britain are the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire in Scotland. These are a regional variant of the stone circle tradition unique to northeast Scotland, characterized by the presence of a single, massive stone lying on its side, flanked by two tall upright stones, all positioned at the southwest of the circle. The recumbent stone and its flankers are always among the largest stones in the circle, and the recumbent itself is always the largest. It creates a visual focal point, a kind of altar, framing the southern sky in a way that relates to the rising and setting of the moon. The Aberdeenshire recumbent stone circles are not as famous as Stonehenge or Callanish, but they are extraordinarily beautiful, positioned in a landscape of hills and farmland with the kind of rightness of placement that speaks of long familiarity with the terrain. Easter Ackworthy's, near Inverurie, is one of the finest examples. Its pinkish granite stones set in a near-perfect circle with the massive, grey recumbent lying heavy and deliberate between its flankers, surrounded by a ring cairn that fills the interior of the circle with low stone. The site faces south and slightly west, toward a gap in the hills through which the moon, at its major standstill, sets in a manner that appears to interact with the recumbent stone. We do not know the name these people gave to the moon. We do not know what they called the stones. We do not know whether the ceremonies they conducted here were joyful or solemn, long or brief, seasonal or constant. All we know is that they came here, that they arranged these particular stones in this particular configuration, facing this particular part of the sky, and that the precision with which they did so tells us that it mattered to them with an intensity we cannot directly measure, but can dimly feel, standing in the circle on a winter afternoon, with the sun already going down and the light changing fast across the hills. Now let me take you south again, back to southern England, to a series of sites that have been generating quiet excitement in the archaeological community for the past decade or so. We are going to talk about the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, a multi-year research program that used magnetometry, ground-penetrating radar, resistivity measurement, and other non-invasive techniques to survey the landscape around Stonehenge with an unprecedented level of detail. The results of that survey have been transformative. The landscape around Stonehenge, which was already understood to be rich with prehistoric remains, turns out to be almost unimaginably dense with them. New Cursus monuments, new enclosures, new barrow cemeteries, dozens of anomalies that require explanation, and most dramatically, buried under what has been a natural-looking section of the landscape for centuries, evidence of structures so large and so unusual that they have their researchers reaching for terms like superhenge. The structure near Dorrington Walls, detected in 2015, as I mentioned earlier, was only one of the discoveries. In subsequent years, the survey revealed what appears to be a series of enormous pits or shaft monuments arranged in patterns across the landscape, not just near Dorrington Walls, but in multiple locations. Some of them potentially representing a tradition of creating underground sacred spaces that runs parallel to the tradition of creating upstanding monuments, and that has left almost no surface trace for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. The relationship between these underground features and the above-ground monuments is something that the next generation of archaeologists will spend their careers working out. What we can say now is that the landscape in which Stonehenge stands was not simply an undifferentiated backdrop for a single monument. It was itself a monument, comprehensively shaped and marked and modified over more than 2,000 years of continuous sacred attention. A landscape so thoroughly transformed by human meaning that it functions as a text in 3 dimensions, written in chalk and earth and stone and timber, by people who knew how to make the land itself speak. Far to the north, in the Highlands of Scotland, there is a type of monument called a broch, and brochs deserve our attention because they represent something else entirely, something that does not fit neatly into the narrative of ancient sacred landscapes and astronomical alignments, something that speaks more directly of the daily lives and practical necessities of prehistoric people. A broch is a circular tower, built without mortar from carefully chosen and fitted stone, rising in some cases to over 30 meters in height. Internally, they are hollow, with a central open space and a series of internal galleries accessed through low doorways in the thickness of the wall. Over 500 brochs have been identified in Scotland, distributed across the northern and western islands and the highlands and the far north, and each one represents an extraordinary feat of dry stone construction that has maintained its basic integrity without any need for maintenance for up to 2,000 years. The Broch of Mouser, on the Shetland island of Mouser, is the best preserved example, standing to a height of 13 meters, virtually complete, the most complete prehistoric building in northern Europe. Standing beside it on a summer evening, when the light does not fully leave the sky, when the sea is visible in every direction and the seabirds are crying over the water, you feel the weight of the human effort invested in this structure, with an immediacy that is different from what you feel at Stonehenge or Callanish. The Broch is not mystical, it is practical, it is domestic, it is a house, a very tall, very well built, very enduring house, constructed for people who needed to be defended, who needed to keep their livestock safe and their children warm through northern winters of ferocious intensity. And yet, even the brochs have something about them that resists a purely utilitarian explanation. The skill and consistency of their construction across a very wide geographical area implies a tradition of building knowledge that was maintained and transmitted with great care. The training of broch builders, if we can call it that, required extended apprenticeship and sustained practice. The materials were selected with attention. The proportions are consistent enough across hundreds of examples to suggest shared standards that went beyond simple functional necessity. These were not just shelters, they were statements. They were expressions of something, of a way of being in the world, of a relationship between people and the land and the sea and the community of their peers that deserves to be thought about rather than simply admired. I want to talk about water, about the sacred significance of water in the prehistoric British tradition, because it runs through this entire story in ways that surface repeatedly and that I have not yet addressed directly. Britain is a wet island. There is no part of it that is more than 100 kilometers from the sea. Its interior is threaded with rivers and dotted with lakes and marshes and springs. Water was not a background condition in the lives of prehistoric British people. It was a presence, constant and various, warm in summer hollows and cold in upland streams, salt along the coasts and fresh in the valleys, sometimes abundant and sometimes desperately needed. And it was sacred, or rather, the boundary between land and water was sacred, the threshold through which things could pass from one world to another. The practice of depositing valuable objects in rivers and lakes and bogs is one of the most consistent traditions in British prehistory from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. Not occasional deposits, not accidents of loss, but systematic, repeated, intentional offerings, weapons and tools and ornaments, and sometimes people, lowered into the water or placed at the river's edge with a deliberateness that speaks of ceremony, of exchange, of giving something precious to the water in expectation of something in return. Lindoman is perhaps the best-known example of the human offerings. Found in a peat bog in Cheshire in 1984, preserved for 2,000 years by the chemistry of the bog, he was a man of around 25, well-nourished, with carefully trimmed beard and hair and nails, who had been killed by a sequence of blows, a garrote, and a cut to the throat, then placed in the bog. This level of violence speaks of ritual rather than simple murder. The care taken with his body before death, the multiple methods of killing, the placement in the water. These are the marks of ceremony, of something being enacted with deliberate care rather than passionate haste. The Thames has yielded a continuous supply of Bronze Age and Iron Age metalwork for centuries, every year producing more weapons and shields and ornaments that were placed in the water, not by accident, but by design. The river was understood as a boundary, a passage, a presence that could receive offerings and act on them, that could take the precious thing you placed in it and convey it to wherever it was that rivers went when they went below the ground. The springs were equally important. The hot springs at Bath, where naturally heated water rises from the earth in a phenomenon that seemed genuinely miraculous to people who did not know about geothermal heat, were already sacred long before the Romans arrived and formalized the worship there with their elaborate temple to Sulis Minerva. The pits around the spring contained thousands of objects thrown in as offerings, coins mostly in the Roman period, but before that, other things, things made to be given away, things that cost something to make and more to part with. Sacred springs dot the British landscape. Many of them were Christianized in the early medieval period, given the names of saints who were said to have prayed there, or been born there, or died there, surrounded with small stone enclosures and roofed with tiny chapels. Glastonbury, Chalice Well, St Winifred's Well in North Wales, St Nun's Well in Cornwall. The practice of tying rags to the trees around a sacred well, the Clutie tradition, still continues at some sites, despite being denounced periodically by the Church since the Middle Ages. Old traditions persist. They change their names but keep their roots. The well is holy, whatever the name on the plaque above it says. The long history of sacred water sites in Britain reaches its most dramatic expression in the lake deposits of the Bronze and Iron Ages, but it begins much earlier. There are Neolithic polished stone axes that were clearly never used as tools, made with a precision and beauty of finish that far exceeds what any practical axe requires, and many of these luxury axes come from specific quarrying sites, specific mountains, the Langdale Pikes in the Lake District most famously, where the evidence of quarrying high on the steep face of the fell suggests that the altitude and difficulty of access were themselves part of the point, that the labour of obtaining the stone from an extreme and dramatic location was itself a sacred act, part of what made the finished axe carry the power it carried when it was given or used or eventually deposited. Langdale axes have been found across Britain, far from their source, traded and gifted and perhaps inherited across generations. They carry with them, in a sense, the memory of the mountain, the residue of the dangerous and sacred act of quarrying from a high rocky face. They are not just tools, they are objects that contain a history and a connection to a specific place that gave them their meaning. When one was deposited in a river or a lake, it brought with it that history, that mountain, that difficulty, that memory of someone climbing to a high cold place and taking a piece of it away. We are deep into the night now, and I have been walking you through a landscape that is not just ancient, but layered, occupied, repeatedly interpreted and reinterpreted across thousands of years of human attention. Every site we have visited has been used by more than one group of people, interpreted by more than one tradition, marked and maintained, and eventually, half forgotten and rediscovered by more than one civilization. This is not a simple story of primitive people making monuments and then being replaced by more advanced people who built better things. It is a story of continuity and transformation, of each generation finding in the ancient landscape something that spoke to its own concerns, its own fears, its own understanding of the relationship between human life and the larger forces within which human life is embedded. The people who built Stonehenge did not think of themselves as prehistoric. They did not think of themselves as ancient. They were simply people, living in a world that made sense to them, doing things that were important in that world, building structures that expressed and enabled what mattered to them. They happened to build them in stone and earth, which is why we can still see what they made. The vast majority of what they thought and believed and said and sang has vanished utterly, leaving only the physical evidence and our attempts to read it. And we read it through the distorting lens of who we are. We are people for whom the sky is a backdrop rather than a clock, for whom the earth is infrastructure rather than relationship, for whom the dead are absent rather than present. When we look at a monument like Stonehenge and try to understand what it meant to the people who built it, we are attempting something genuinely difficult, genuinely humbling. The act of understanding minds that operated in a framework so different from our own that we cannot simply translate from one to the other. What we can do is pay attention. We can stand at the edge of the ditch at Avebury on a winter morning and let the scale of the place work on us. We can walk the West Kennet Long Barrow and lie in the narrow stone passage and feel the weight of the earth above us and the stone around us and the long corridor of time behind us. We can stand at the entrance of my show in December and watch the light come down the passage and touch the back wall of the chamber and feel, however briefly, what it might have felt like to have built this place and come here in the darkest week of the year and seen the sun return. These experiences do not give us the answers, but they bring us into a kind of proximity with the questions, a physical, embodied proximity that changes how we hold them. There is one more thing I want to tell you about before we close, one more discovery that seems to me to capture something essential about what we have been exploring together tonight. In the years since 2009, archaeologists working across Britain have been using a technique called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, an aerial survey technology that can penetrate tree canopy and reveal the shape of the ground beneath it with extraordinary precision. When LiDAR surveys are applied to forested areas that have never been archaeologically surveyed, they reveal a landscape of human modification that has been hidden by centuries of tree growth. The results have been, without overstating the case, breathtaking. In forests across Wales and Scotland and England, LiDAR has revealed field systems and earthworks and enclosures and monuments that were completely unknown, some hidden under the trees since the medieval period when the forest grew back over farmland abandoned after the Black Death or earlier demographic collapses. The density of these hidden features suggests a level of prehistoric land use that our existing map of monuments and sites, based mostly on surface survey and known excavation, had profoundly underestimated. We had thought, in other words, that we knew roughly how much there was. We were wrong. The landscape of prehistoric Britain is more comprehensively marked by human action than we had understood. The monuments we know about, the great stone circles and the hill forts and the barrows and the cursus monuments, are the most visible fraction of a total transformation of the landscape that was far more thorough and far more continuous than the traditional narrative acknowledged. This should be humbling, and in a way it is. But it is also extraordinary because it means that the story is still being written. Every year, new sites are found. Every year, new technology allows us to see things that were invisible before. Every year, the ancient landscape of Britain reveals another layer of the civilization, or civilizations that made it. We have not run out of questions. We have barely started asking them. The night is deep now. The stars are out, if you are somewhere with clear sky, and they are the same stars that the builders of Stonehenge watched with such careful attention that they understood its movements well enough to build their entire world around them. The moon, if it is visible, is moving on the path that the builders of Callanish tracked across 18.61 year cycles and encoded in the orientation of their stones. The ground beneath wherever you are lying is the same ground that has been walked and modified and inscribed by people for at least 10,000 years in Britain, and probably longer. We are not separate from this history. We are inside it. We are one more layer in the landscape, one more generation of people doing things on this island that future generations will find baffling or impressive or moving or all three at once. We are making our own monuments, though they are digital now, inscribed in servers rather than stone, and we are telling our own stories about who we are and where we come from and what the world means. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the concrete and the tarmac and the electric light, the chalk is still there. The stones are still there. The ancient paths still run beneath the roads, their ghost lines visible in the way that village streets sometimes bend for no obvious reason, following the curve of something that was there, long before the village was. The springs are still rising. The rivers are still running toward the sea. The civilization we cannot explain is still speaking, if we know how to listen. Its language is not words. It is stone and earth and alignment and axis and the precise angle at which winter sunlight enters a passage tomb on the shortest day of the year. It is the weight of a Langdale axe in the hand and the echo in a Brock stairwell and the feeling of standing inside a stone circle, with the wind moving through the grass and the knowledge that human hands placed every one of these stones here, that human minds decided where each one should go, that human lives were organized around these places in ways we cannot fully recover but cannot stop trying to understand. They were here before us. They made something extraordinary, and they left it in the ground for us to find, in the chalk and the stone and the peat, sleeping patiently, waiting for whoever would come next, and find it, and wonder at it, and begin, as we always must begin, with the most ancient and the most honest of all human responses to the incomprehensible and the beautiful. To simply stand before it and not know what to say. The fire is low now. The embers are the kind of deep red that means the warmth will last for hours yet, even as the light fades. Somewhere outside, an owl is hunting, its call carrying across the dark fields, in the way that owl calls have carried across dark fields, here for longer than memory goes. The chalk is down there beneath the grass, white and cool and enduring, and the stones are where they were placed, and the barrows are sealed with their old questions, and the henges hold their circles against the sky, as they have held them through 100 generations of people walking past and wondering. You can let your eyes close now. The ancient landscape will still be there in the morning, as it has been there every morning for 5,000 years of mornings. The mysteries will still be there. The questions will still be asking themselves in the language of stone and earth and sky. You have walked a long way tonight, through a landscape that is deeper and stranger and more extraordinary than any simple history can contain. You have stood at the edges of things that human minds made and human time has not explained. You have listened to the wind in the stones, and the silence inside the chamber, and the light moving down the passage toward the solstice morning. Rest now. The world beneath you is very old, and it is still holding everything that was given to it, and it is still asking, in the patient way of old things, whether we are ready yet to understand what it is saying. Rest now. Good night. The chalk hills of southern England have a quality that photographers find frustrating and painters find irresistible. On overcast days, which are most days, the light is flat and grey, and the landscape appears bleached and undifferentiated, a pale rolling sameness, stretching from horizon to horizon under a sky that gives nothing away. But on those occasional mornings when the sun breaks, through low in the east, and the dew is still on the grass, and the mist is still in the valleys, the chalk suddenly catches the light and becomes luminous, almost incandescent, the white of the underlying rock showing through the thin soil in a way that makes the whole hill seem to glow from within. On such mornings, the earthworks are most visible. The banks cast long shadows across the ditch beside them. The ridge of a barrow stands sharp against the pale sky. The bleached grass within the rings of a henge is subtly different in colour from the grass without. You see the landscape as it was meant to be seen, the modifications of human hands, legible in a way they are not when the light is flat, the ancient pattern of use and meaning, suddenly readable in the shadows. This is one of the reasons the people who built these monuments in the chalk landscape chose this material and this terrain. The chalk reveals itself. It is self-disclosing. Cut into it, and the wound stays white for decades, even centuries. The monuments in chalk were not subtle. They were intended to be seen, to announce themselves to the landscape around them, to assert the presence of the community that built them and the power of the beliefs that motivated them. In an age before any other form of mass communication, the visibility of your monument was a statement about who you were. The Neolithic builders understood landscape aesthetics in ways that we would recognize as sophisticated. The positioning of monuments on skylines, so that they appear as dark shapes against the sky to people approaching them, is consistent across many sites and across many centuries. The choice of locations where a monument can be seen from a distance, where the sight lines are long and the monument dominates the view from multiple directions, is not accidental. These were designed to be seen as well as to see from. They were orientated both toward the sky above and toward the community of people who would encounter them in the landscape. The visibility of ancient monuments from each other is something that researchers have spent considerable time studying and mapping. The sight line from Stonehenge to certain other sites in the Stonehenge landscape is demonstrable and has been demonstrated. The intervisibility of the Avebury monuments with each other and with distant natural features like Windmill Hill and the Ridgeway is also documented. Whether these sight lines were intentional, built into the design of the monuments from the beginning, or whether they arose naturally from the fact that all the monuments were placed on prominent high ground for the same reasons, is a question that does not have a simple answer. But the experience of standing on one ancient monument and seeing another in the middle distance, knowing that people have stood on this spot and looked toward that spot for 5,000 years, is one of those moments where the past becomes briefly, viscerally present. The line between where you are and where you are looking has been seen before, by many eyes, in many conditions of light and weather, over a span of time so immense that your own brief passage through it feels simultaneously meaningless and deeply significant. We have not yet talked about what was going on in the eastern part of Britain during the great building periods, and we should, because the flat fenlands and the chalk uplands of eastern England have their own rich tradition of prehistoric monument building that is poorly understood compared to the famous sites of the south and west. The Breckland of Norfolk and Suffolk, a sandy heathland landscape that sits on chalk, is studded with Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments. Grimes Graves, perhaps the most extraordinary, is a Neolithic flint mine, a landscape of over 400 shafts sunk into the chalk to extract the high-quality flint nodules that formed the basis of the Neolithic toolkit. The shafts are up to 14 meters deep, connected by horizontal galleries that radiated out from their bases at the level of the best flint seams. Mining these shafts required courage, physical endurance, and technical knowledge. The miners worked by the light of chalk cups filled with burning animal fat, kneeling and lying in confined underground spaces, extracting the flint with antler picks and bone and wooden tools. At the base of one shaft, excavators found a small figure, a rough human form fashioned from chalk, placed in a deliberate depression in the floor in a way that clearly speaks of ceremony. Around it, chalk balls and a chalk phallus, offerings of some kind, placed at the bottom of a mine shaft in the chalk. The darkness, the depth, the earth, and the explicit symbolism of fertility and increase. These things were connected in the minds of the people who worked here. The act of extracting the flint from the earth was understood within a framework that required acknowledgement, propitiation, the maintenance of a relationship between the people who took and the earth that gave. Away from the flint mines, the eastern English landscape was being transformed in a different way during the Bronze Age, a way that represents perhaps the most systematic and deliberate reordering of landscape in British prehistory. The Bronze Age field systems of Dartmoor in Devon and of similar upland areas in Yorkshire and elsewhere represent the division of entire landscapes into bounded enclosures, field systems of astonishing regularity laid out across the moorland with a precision that implies central planning and organised labour. The reeves of Dartmoor are the best preserved. They are stone-walled boundaries, low but identifiable, stretching for miles across the open moorland, dividing it into field systems and territorial blocks. The Dartmoor Reeve system covers an area of several hundred square kilometres and was probably laid out within a relatively short period, perhaps within a generation or two, around 1500 BCE. Its regularity, the consistent orientation of boundaries across a landscape that is topographically varied and challenging, implies a degree of coordinated planning that required not just a decision-maker, but a mechanism for enforcing that decision across a large community of people with individual interests that might not always align with the collective plan. What we are seeing in the Dartmoor Reeves is the beginning of something familiar, the ownership of land. Not land as territory, the hunting range of a mobile group, but land as property, specific bounded pieces of earth attached to specific people or families, marked with walls that announce the claim as clearly as any legal document. This is a profound shift in the relationship between people and land, a shift whose consequences extend forward unbroken to the present day. When someone drew a stone wall across Dartmoor in 1500 BCE and said, "In effect, this is mine," they were initiating a process of enclosure and exclusion that has shaped every subsequent generation of people who have lived in Britain. There is a practice that began in the Neolithic and continued into the early medieval period that I have not yet mentioned, and it is one of the most humanly intimate aspects of the prehistoric record: the deliberate curation of ancestral bones. In the long barrows of the Neolithic, as I mentioned much earlier, the dead were placed in the communal chambers and then, at some later point, the bones were rearranged. The skulls were separated from the long bones. The long bones were stacked. Specific bones were removed and carried elsewhere. What remained in the final sealed tomb was not a collection of individual burials, but a communal accumulation of disarticulated remains, mixed and sorted in ways that suggest the dead were not thought of as separate individuals maintaining their individual identities, even in death, but as a collective resource, an ancestral pool, available to be drawn upon by the living in their relationships with the supernatural world. In practical terms, this meant that bones, particularly skulls, were portable. They moved, they travelled from one place to another as people moved, carrying their ancestors with them. They were possibly displayed, possibly consulted, possibly used as focal objects in rituals that required the physical presence of the dead. The boundary between living and dead was permeable in ways that our own traditions make it difficult to fully conceptualize. The dead were not absent. They were present in specific places, in the monuments built to house them, and also wherever their bones were taken and kept and used. This gives a different character to the long barrows than a simple reading of them as graves would suggest. They were not just places to put the dead. They were places to keep certain dead, the ancestors who were specifically powerful or significant, while others moved through the landscape in the hands of their descendants, present in a more direct and immediate sense. The practice of curating ancestral skulls continued into the Iron Age, where excavations of Iron Age settlements have occasionally revealed human skulls stored in pits or placed in doorways in ways that speak of deliberate keeping and using rather than simple burial. The head, in Celtic tradition as we know it from later textual sources, was understood as the seat of the soul, the most significant part of a person's being, the part that contained whatever it was that made a person who they were. To keep a head, even an enemy's head, was to keep something of great power. The Druids of the later Iron Age, as Roman writers described them, were the custodians of this complex of beliefs and practices, the specialists who knew how to navigate the boundary between living and dead, who knew what the ancestors required and what they offered in return, who maintained the sacred knowledge of alignments and ceremonies and the proper way of doing things that had been accumulating for thousands of years before anyone gave it a name. We should talk about the landscape of the dead in a different sense, the sense in which certain parts of the British landscape were understood for long periods of prehistoric time as specifically belonging to the dead. The uplands of Britain, the moorlands and the high chalk and the bare, windswept ridges show a concentration of funerary monuments that is not random. These were places where the dead were placed, sometimes in large numbers, over many generations. The barrow cemeteries of the Stonehenge landscape, the long barrow cemeteries of the Yorkshire wolds, the ring cairn cemeteries of the Scottish uplands. These were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they were already understood as threshold places, as liminal landscapes, as places where the membrane between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thinner and more permeable than it was in the valleys and the lowlands where people went about their daily business. This understanding of certain landscapes as inherently sacred, as belonging to powers beyond the human, is one that has persisted, in some form in Britain, from prehistoric times to the present. The upland moors have always been understood as uncanny, as potentially dangerous, as possessed by something that has nothing to do with human concerns. The stories that accumulate around them, the black dogs and the will-o'-the-wisps and the spectral riders and the mysterious lights, are expressions of a persistent intuition that the moors are not entirely human territory, that something else is at home there, something older and less sympathetic than the landscape of the valleys and the towns. Whether that intuition is a survival of genuine prehistoric belief, or simply an instinctive response to the exposure and bleakness of high moorland in bad weather, it has given the uplands of Britain a particular quality in the cultural imagination that distinguishes them from the domesticated lowlands. They are where the old things live. They are where the old rules apply. They are where you go to encounter something that cannot be encountered in the village or the town, something that was there before the village was built and will be there after it is gone. The hill forts that dominated the Iron Age landscape of Britain continued in use, in modified form, into the early medieval period and in some cases beyond. The largest and most significant of them, the great multi-vallate enclosures of the southwest, were apparently still functioning as centres of political and social power in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the period that later tradition would identify as the age of King Arthur. The Arthurian connections of specific hill forts, most notably South Cadbury in Somerset, are not purely modern inventions. South Cadbury Hill Fort has been identified as the possible site of Camelot since at least the 16th century, when the antiquary John Leland recorded a local tradition that the hill was called Camelot and that villagers dug up armour and coins and the like there. Excavation in the 1960s revealed that South Cadbury was indeed substantially refortified in the late 5th century, its Iron Age ramparts rebuilt on a massive scale, the interior replanned to accommodate a large hall and other significant structures. Someone of considerable resources was using this site as a power centre in exactly the period when a king named Arthur is supposed to have existed. This does not prove that Arthur was real, or that South Cadbury was Camelot, or that the details of the legend have any reliable historical basis. But it does demonstrate that the tradition of using ancient hill forts as political centres did not simply end with the Roman occupation. The knowledge that these sites were powerful, that they commanded their landscapes, that they had been places of significance for a very long time, persisted into the post-Roman period, and the people who reoccupied them were doing so in full awareness of their ancient significance. The landscape of Arthurian Britain, the real landscape rather than the romantic one, was a landscape of ancient monuments repurposed, ancient paths still in use, ancient sacred sites given new names but retaining their fundamental importance. Glastonbury, whatever its religious significance in the early medieval period, sat in a landscape that had been sacred since the Neolithic. The Isle of Avalon of legend, if it refers to anything geographical, refers to a place where the ancient and the powerful intersect, where the world of the dead is accessible, where the great old ones can be found if you know where to look. This is not the language of Christian pilgrimage. It is the language of something much older. Let me tell you about a discovery made in 1999 in the village of Amesbury, just 2 miles from Stonehenge, that changed the way we think about the people who built the monument. The Amesbury archer was found in a grave that dated to around 2300 BCE, very close to the period of the main Sarsen construction at Stonehenge. He was a man of about 35 to 45, heavily built, with an old, healed wound on his knee that would have given him a pronounced limp for most of his adult life. He was buried with an extraordinary assemblage of grave goods, over 100 objects, the richest Bronze Age burial ever found in Britain, including copper knives and gold hair ornaments and a cushion stone for working metal and 16 flint arrowheads and 5 beaker pots of the type associated with the incoming continental population that was transforming British society at this period. Analysis of the enamel of his teeth revealed his origin. The chemical signature preserved in the tooth enamel reflects the geology of the ground where a person grew up, and the Amesbury archer's signature was not British. He came from the Alps, from what is now Switzerland or Austria or southern Germany, a distance of several thousand miles from the place where he was buried. He was not alone. A younger man buried nearby, possibly a relative, showed a different isotopic signature that suggested an origin in Britain, possibly in the area of Scotland or Wales. 2 men from very different places, buried near each other near Stonehenge, around the period of its most intensive construction, both surrounded by objects of extraordinary quality and significance. The Amesbury archer is sometimes called the King of Stonehenge, though that title tells us more about our own desire for simple narratives than about who he actually was. What his burial tells us is that Stonehenge, in its peak period, was drawing people from very long distances, that its reputation or significance was known across a large part of Europe, and that the social elite associated with it had connections that stretched far beyond the British landscape into a continental network of exchange and relationship that we are still mapping. This is not a parochial site. This is not a monument built by an isolated local community for local purposes. This is a monument that was embedded in a European-wide network of exchange and movement and shared symbolism. A monument whose fame was such that a man from the Alps chose to be buried near it when he died in his late middle age in southern England, and whose community considered him important enough to send him to the next world with 100 objects of great value and significance. The tradition of sacred landscape in Britain did not end with the coming of Christianity. It was absorbed by it, transformed by it, given new names and new stories, but the underlying impulse, the need to mark certain places as charged with significance, to tend those places, to make them focal points for community gathering and spiritual practice. That impulse was older than any religion and survived the coming of every new religion that arrived on these islands. The early Celtic Church, which developed in Ireland and spread to Scotland and northern England in the 5th and 6th centuries, had a relationship with the natural landscape that distinguished it sharply from the urban Christianity of the Mediterranean world, from which it ultimately derived its theology. The Celtic monastic tradition placed its establishments in remote and challenging locations, on islands, on cliff tops, in river valleys far from any settlement, in places that were wild and difficult and beautiful in the way that holy things are beautiful, a beauty that is also awe, that is also something close to fear. Skellig Michael off the coast of Kerry in Ireland is the most dramatic example, though it is Irish rather than British. But its equivalents exist in Britain. The monastery of Lindisfarne on its tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, accessible only twice a day when the tide goes out. The community at Iona in the Outer Hebrides, chosen by Columba for its remoteness and its quality of light. The hermitages cut into the cliffs of Cornwall and Wales and the Scottish Islands. Single rooms in the rock face where a person could sit with the sea below and the sky above and feel the full, exposed weight of the world. These places were chosen because they were already understood as places where the boundary between human and divine was thinner than elsewhere. They were, in other words, chosen for the same reason that the Neolithic monument builders chose their locations. Because something was already there, already perceptible in the quality of the air and the light and the sound, something that the builders, whoever they were and whatever they believed, recognized as significant and sought to mark. We have been speaking for a long time about megastructures, about the great engineering achievements of prehistoric Britain, and I want to end with something smaller, something that counterbalances the grandeur of Stonehenge and the complexity of the Ness of Brodgar with a more intimate scale of ancient human activity. The cup and ring marks. These are carved petroglyphs, pecked into exposed rock surfaces across Britain, from the uplands of Northumberland to the moors of Yorkshire, to the hillsides of Scotland. Simple in form, circles and spirals and cups and connected patterns, made by people who were not building monuments in the monumental sense, but who were inscribing their presence into the landscape at a scale that a single person could accomplish in a single afternoon. Cup and ring marks appear in enormous numbers at certain sites, dozens of individual carvings overlapping and accumulating on the same rock surface, as if generation after generation returned to the same exposed stone and added their own marks to the marks that were already there. Some of the panels are so dense that the surface is almost entirely covered with overlapping circles and spirals and connecting lines, a visual accumulation over centuries that creates the impression of a language being written and rewritten in the same notebook. What do they mean? We do not know. We have never known. The petroglyphs of other cultures around the world are difficult enough to interpret when we have ethnographic testimony from descendants of the people who made them. In Britain, all such direct testimony is lost. We have the marks and nothing else. The theories range from maps to astronomical records, to hallucinatory visions, to territorial markers, to pure decoration. And none of them is compelling enough to have achieved consensus. What is compelling is the act of making them. Someone sat on this rock, in this location, with a harder stone in their hand, and pecked patiently at the surface, hour after hour, until the pattern they had in mind had been transferred from their imagination to the permanent record of stone. This was not casual. This was not accidental. Whatever these marks meant to the person who made them, making them was worth the effort of sustained, careful, deliberate physical labor. They mattered. The marks mattered enough to be made, and they have lasted. 3,000 years later, on a grey morning on a hillside in Northumberland, a walker puts their hand on a cool, flat stone and feels the shallow cups beneath their fingertips, carved by someone who was also in this landscape, also looking out over these hills, also doing something that seemed to them significant and worth doing. The connection is not imaginary. It is physical. The stone is the same stone. The hillside is the same hillside. The sky above is the same sky. The night is fully dark now, wherever you are, and I have one last thing I want to give you before you sleep. Not information, not another site or another theory or another extraordinary discovery. Something simpler. The people who made all of this, the builders of the henges, and the barrows, and the stone circles, the miners and the metal workers, and the artists who made the cups and rings on the hillside rocks, were not fundamentally different from you. Their brains were the same size and same complexity as yours. Their emotional lives were as rich and as confused and as capable of wonder as yours. They loved their children and feared the dark and watched the stars with the same mixture of fascination and bewilderment that we feel when we look at them now. They did not know that they were building something that would outlast them by 5,000 years. They did not know that future people would stand beside their monuments and try to understand them. They built because building was what their community did in response to the things that mattered to them. They aligned their chambers with the solstice sun because the returning sun was important to people who depended on the seasons for everything. They placed their dead in visible and accessible monuments because the relationship between living and dead was not severed in their understanding, because the ancestors were needed and consulted and maintained. They were doing what all humans do, in all times and all places. They were trying to make the world make sense. They were trying to find the pattern beneath the surface of things. They were trying to connect the life they were living to something larger and more enduring than any single human lifetime. They were trying to say, we were here. This mattered. The world is stranger and more beautiful and more demanding than it appears. And here is what we understood of it, written in stone and earth and chalk so that it will last. And it has lasted. Despite the weather and the field clearances and the medieval Christians and the quarrying and the road building and everything else that the centuries have done to the landscape of Britain, so much of it has lasted. Not intact, not unaltered, but present, identifiable, still legible in its broad outline even if the fine print is gone. We were here. This mattered. That is perhaps the most important thing that any civilization has ever said. In the summer of 2020, archaeologists announced the discovery of a monument near Stonehenge that had not been suspected, had not been predicted, and that took the field completely by surprise. A series of massive pits arranged in a circle, as I mentioned earlier, but also newly discovered evidence of a wooden structure, or the remains of one, buried beneath what had seemed to be completely undifferentiated farmland, a mile or so from the famous stones. The discovery was made not by digging, but by drone photography during an exceptional drought year, when the parched earth above buried features turned different shades of brown than the earth around them, revealing through the surviving grass the ghost outline of a monument that has been invisible at ground level for 2,000 years. Drone photography in drought years has become one of the most powerful tools in British field archaeology, capable of revealing in a few summer days what conventional survey might miss entirely. What this tells us, as I have said but it bears repeating, is that we are still discovering these things. The ancient landscape of Britain is not a closed book. New chapters are still being found in it, hidden in the earth, waiting for the right technology and the right conditions to reveal themselves. The tradition of astonishment that accompanies every new discovery, the feeling that the ancient world was larger and stranger and more sophisticated than we had believed, is a tradition that will continue. We are not at the end of this story. We are somewhere in the middle of it. And that is, when you think about it, exactly where we should be. In the middle of a story. Still discovering. Still surprised. Still humbled by what the chalk and the stone and the ancient earth have to teach us. If we are willing to be patient and attentive and appropriately humble about how much we do not yet know. The owls are still calling. The fire has burned very low now. The coals still warm, but the light almost gone. Somewhere outside in the dark, the fields are lying under the night sky, the chalk in them still white below the soil. The ancient paths still running through the grass toward horizons that have been meaningful to human eyes for longer than we can fully imagine. Sleep is close. You can feel it in the way the edges of things have softened, in the way the words are washing over you, now rather than requiring active comprehension, in the way your breathing has slowed and your body has settled into wherever it is lying, the ancient earth patient and dark beneath you. The monuments are out there in the dark. Stonehenge with its great trilithons standing against the night sky. Avebury with its village sleeping inside the ancient bank. My show sealed and silent until December, when the sun will find its way down the passage again and fill the chamber with light. Callanish on its windy Atlantic headland, the stones rising from the heather into the salt air. The White Horse on its chalk hillside, visible even in moonlight to those who know where to look. They are all out there, patient as stone, old as chalk, keeping whatever they know about who made them and why and what happened in that world and how it ended and what came after. They are not giving up their secrets quickly. They have learned over 5,000 years of being studied and speculated about and occasionally excavated that patience is the greatest advantage a monument has over the people who want to understand it. We will understand them better in time. The technology will improve, and the surveys will extend, and the ancient DNA will give up more of its information, and the LiDAR surveys will penetrate deeper into the forested uplands, and the crop marks will appear in new drought summers, and the tidal zones will expose more preserved timbers, and we will piece together more of what we currently do not know. But we will never understand them completely. Some of what was thought and felt and believed and enacted in these places has been gone since the last person who knew it died, since the last ceremony was performed, since the last stone was placed and the last word was spoken. That loss is irreversible. And perhaps it should be. Perhaps some things are rightly temporary, held in human minds and hearts and not in stone, alive while the people who carry them are alive and then gone when they are gone, as our own most intimate thoughts and feelings will be gone when we are gone. What remains is the stone, and the stone says enough. It says there were people here who thought carefully about where the sun rose and where it set, and what those moments meant. It says there were people here who understood that the dead were not simply absent, that the relationship with the ancestors had to be maintained, that the past was not over, but was present in every moment in which the living went about their lives. It says there were people here who could organize themselves across generations to accomplish things that could not be accomplished in a single lifetime, who could transmit knowledge and intention and shared purpose across time in the absence of writing. It says there were people here who cared about beauty, who did more than was strictly necessary, because doing more than was strictly necessary was what made them human. The stone says all of this. You just have to stand beside it long enough to hear. Now let the stones be quiet. Let the chalk be dark. Let the hills go back to sleep under their covering of grass and cloud, and let the night have the last word, as it always does in the end. You have come a long way tonight. You have walked the ancient paths and stood inside the ancient chambers and felt the weight of the ancient stones and listened to the silence that lives inside them. You have tried, as all of us who are drawn to these places try, to hear something in that silence that will bring the builders back, that will make the past briefly present, that will close the enormous gap of time between their world and ours. You have not fully succeeded. None of us ever do. But you have come closer than you were, and perhaps that is enough for one night. The gap is a little smaller, the silence a little more inhabited, the ancient landscape a little more present in your understanding of the island you live on, or are thinking of, the old chalk bones of it running beneath everything, the stones rising from the fields, the paths worn deep by feet that have long since stopped walking. Sleep now. The ancient world will be there in the morning. It has been there every morning for 5,000 years, patient and strange and beautiful, waiting for whoever has the time and the inclination to pay attention to it. Tomorrow you can look again. Tonight, rest. The night is all around you. The stones are in their circles. The barrows are sealed. The chalk is cool and white in the dark beneath the grass. Good night. But the story does not quite end there, does it? Because the truth about Britain's ancient landscape is that the rediscovering never stops. The wandering never stops. The reaching back into the deep dark of time never fully settles into satisfaction. There is always another layer, always another question that the previous answer has generated, always another anomaly in the chalk, another alignment that has been missed, another site that has been sitting under a hedge or a car park or a modern housing development for decades, waiting for someone with the right equipment and the right questions to find it. So let us keep going for a little while longer into the deeper hours of this particular night, because the landscape we have been exploring has more to offer than any single telling can exhaust. And you are still here, still listening, still willing to travel a little further into the ancient dark. There is a place in the Outer Hebrides, on the island of Lewis, that I have mentioned, and that deserves more than a passing reference. The Callanaea's standing stones, which I have been calling by their anglicised name, Callanish, were erected in their final form around 2900 BCE, placing them among the oldest stone circles in the British Isles. But the story of the Callanaea stones does not begin with the stone circle. Beneath the circle, preserved under a layer of peat that accumulated after the monument was abandoned, archaeologists found evidence of earlier activity, cultivation ridges, traces of a field system that was already ancient when the stones were raised. The people who built the Callanaea stones chose a location that had already been cultivated, already been used, already been invested with human attention. They did not choose a virgin landscape. They chose a used landscape, one that carried the memory of previous occupation in its soil, and they planted their great stones in it, converting a place of agricultural production into a place of something else, something that required the permanent presence of these enormous grey rocks in a way that farming did not. The Callanaea stones themselves are Lewisian gneiss, as I mentioned, nearly 3 billion years old, among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the earth. When the people of Lewis quarried these stones and raised them in their circle and their avenues, they were working with material that was ancient beyond any possible comprehension to them, ancient beyond any timescale their myths could encompass. They were making something new out of something impossibly old, and what they made has now itself become impossibly old in relation to us. The major lunar standstill that I described earlier, the event that occurs once every 18.61 years, when the moon reaches the southernmost point of its arc, is visible from Callanaeus in a way that occurs nowhere else in the British Isles with such dramatic effect. As the moon rises over the hills to the south on the night of its standstill, it appears to walk along the hilltops before entering and then passing through the stone circle and setting to the west. Witnesses who have seen this describe it as one of the most extraordinary natural phenomena in the landscape of Britain. The moon so low that it seems to be walking on the ground rather than sailing in the sky, its light flooding the ancient stones. The people who built the Callanaea stones would have had to observe the lunar cycle for at least 19 years to understand when the standstill would occur. This implies a community with the institutional continuity to maintain that observation and that knowledge across nearly 2 decades, with the organizational capacity to then act on that knowledge in the construction of a monument, and with the understanding that the monument would still be there, still functioning, still aligned in 19 years' time when the next standstill occurred. This is not improvised. This is planned across generations. This is civilization, in the only sense that matters, a community that can maintain and transmit knowledge and purpose across time. There is a corner of West Wales, in the uplands above the town of Llanidloes in Montgomeryshire, where the landscape is so comprehensively dotted with prehistoric sites that archaeologists working in the area sometimes refer to it as the Cambrian Mountains Complex, though that name is not official and the full extent of the complex is not yet mapped. Standing stones and ring cairns and long cairns and trackways and hill forts accumulate in the landscape in a density that suggests continuous use and significance over thousands of years. One site in this landscape, known as the Cerigwai Goff Stones, is a small and almost completely unknown complex of standing stones and cairns that sits in a high boggy valley above the forest line. Getting there requires a 2-hour walk across rough moorland, and the site, when you arrive at it, is modest by the standards of Stonehenge or Callanish. A handful of stones, some tumbled, one still standing, a small cairn nearby. Nothing that would appear in a tourist brochure, but the location is extraordinary. On a clear day, you can see the Irish Sea to the west, the summit of Plinlimmon to the east, the whole of the Cambrian Mountains laid out in every direction. The people who placed these stones here, whoever they were and whenever they came, chose a place of maximum visibility, a place from which the whole landscape could be understood at once, a place that felt, and still feels, like the still centre of a very large turning world. These small and unknown sites, the ones that do not appear on the tourist maps and that require effort to reach, are in some ways more moving than the famous ones. Nobody has built a car park here. Nobody has erected an interpretive panel. The stones stand as they have always stood, subject to the same weather and the same light, visited by sheep and occasionally by walkers who happen to have a good map and the curiosity to follow it to this particular corner of an already remote landscape. The famous sites carry with them the weight of their own fame. Stonehenge has been interpreted and studied and celebrated and argued over for so long that it is now almost impossible to approach it without the weight of all that interpretation pressing on the experience. What Stonehenge means to you is inevitably shaped by what others have said it means, by the images you have seen, by the stories you have read. The famous sites are public monuments in a way that Cerrig Goff is not. They belong to everyone, which means they belong to no one in particular. The unknown sites belong to the landscape, to the weather, to the occasional walker who sits down beside them and looks out at the view and wonders, in the private way that solitary people wonder in remote landscapes, about the hands that placed this stone and the eyes that saw from this spot what I am seeing now, and what they made of it, and whether what they made of it had anything at all in common with what I make of it. The practice of thinking about prehistoric Britain has a history of its own that is worth briefly considering. For most of the medieval period, the monuments were understood through a mythology that was not interested in the distant past as such, but in an imagined national history that justified present-day political arrangements. The giants who built Stonehenge, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century account, were used to justify the grandeur of the British kingdom, to give it a past commensurate with Rome and Troy. Merlin, the wizard who transported the stones from Ireland to Salisbury Plain, was a way of acknowledging that the stones were inexplicably large and heavy, while avoiding the uncomfortable conclusion that ordinary human beings had moved them. The Renaissance brought a different approach. Antiquaries began to look at the monuments with something closer to what we would recognize as archaeological curiosity, recording their dimensions and their orientations, comparing them to ancient texts, trying to place them in a rational historical sequence. John Aubrey, in the 17th century, was the first person to survey Avebury properly, the first to record the Aubrey holes at Stonehenge that now bear his name, and one of the first to suggest that the stone circles were temples of the Druids, a theory that was wrong in the specifics, but right in the general intuition that these were places of religious significance to pre-Roman British people. William Stukely, in the 18th century, added to Aubrey's observations with a passion for the monuments that was also a passion for the idea of the ancient Druid, the noble primitive sage, the British equivalent of the classical philosophers whose wisdom Stukely and his contemporaries so much admired. Stukely was the first to recognize that Avebury was part of a much larger complex, including Silbury Hill and the West Kennet Avenue. The first to walk the lines and understand that what he was seeing was not a collection of individual sites, but a designed landscape. He was also, unfortunately, wrong about almost all of the specific interpretations he offered, but wrong in interesting ways, ways that forced the next generation of researchers to think harder about what the monuments actually were. The 19th century brought professionalization to the study of prehistory and also brought the first systematic excavations, with the accompanying opportunity to destroy irreplaceable evidence in the name of understanding it. Sir Richard Colt Hoare and William Cunnington opened hundreds of barrows on Salisbury Plain and the surrounding chalk downlands in the first decade of the 19th century, finding grave goods that they catalogued carefully and human remains that they handled with less care, working quickly by our standards. Driven partly by the excitement of discovery and partly by a social world in which the entertainment of guests required a constant supply of interesting new things to show them. What they found expanded understanding. What they destroyed cannot be recovered. This tension between the desire to know and the damage that knowing can do to the evidence runs through the entire history of British archaeology and has not been resolved, only managed with increasing care and increasingly sophisticated non-invasive technologies that allow us to study the landscape without touching it. The archaeological study of climate is helping us understand the ancient landscape in new ways. We now know that the climate of Britain in the Neolithic was measurably different from today, warmer and drier in general, with episodes of more extreme conditions, both warm and cold, that would have profoundly affected the lives of agricultural communities dependent on reliable harvests. The period around 2200 BCE, the time of the great transition from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age that I described earlier, coincides with a period of climatic disruption that affected large parts of the world. In Egypt, it corresponds to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. In Mesopotamia, it is associated with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. In the Indus Valley, it may have contributed to the decline of the Harappan civilization. In Britain, it coincides with the period when the incoming Belbeca people were arriving and when the great communal monument building tradition was giving way to a more individualized, Bronze Age aristocratic culture. Was the climate change a cause of these shifts, or a coincidence, or an accelerant of changes that would have happened anyway? Archaeologists and climatologists are working together to try to understand the connections. And the picture that is emerging is one of a world in the third millennium BCS that was more interconnected, more sensitive to environmental change, and more dramatically transformed by that change than we had previously understood. The changes in Britain in this period were not happening in isolation. They were part of a global story. This matters because it reminds us that the ancient landscape we are exploring was never static, never simply a timeless prehistoric idyll. It was a landscape in which things changed, sometimes slowly and sometimes with dramatic suddenness, in which communities had to adapt and sometimes failed to adapt, in which the great monuments that seem so permanent to us were built and used and abandoned and repurposed by people who were living with uncertainty and vulnerability and the constant pressure of a world that did not always cooperate with human plans. The tradition of thinking about the ancient landscape of Britain as a unified and coherent whole, rather than as a collection of isolated sites, has developed considerably in recent decades. Researchers like Christopher Tilley and Richard Bradley have argued that the Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments of Britain make most sense when understood as parts of interconnected systems, as elements of a landscape that was being used and modified and made meaningful in a sustained and purposeful way, rather than by separate communities making separate decisions. This perspective, sometimes called phenomenological archaeology, because of its emphasis on the embodied experience of moving through and perceiving ancient landscapes, has been influential and also controversial. Critics point out that we cannot know how ancient people experienced their landscapes, that imposing modern experiential frameworks on prehistoric data is methodologically problematic, that the approach risks becoming more poetry than science. These criticisms are not entirely wrong, but they do not entirely dispose of the approach either, because the monuments were built by people with bodies like ours, who walked through the landscape on legs like ours, who saw and heard and smelled the world in much the way we do. The experience of walking from the West Kennet Long Barrow to Avebury, along the route of the ancient avenue, covering ground that has been walked for 5,000 years, arriving at the Great Circle with sore feet, and the accumulated sensory experience of the miles behind you, is not entirely irrelevant to understanding why the monument is where it is and how it works. The body knows things about ancient landscapes that the map cannot fully convey. Walking them is not a substitute for studying them, but it is a supplement to studying them that the scholars who never leave the library consistently undervalue. The night has grown very quiet now. The deepest part of it, the hours when the world seems to have stopped its rotation and the darkness has settled permanently, when the morning feels like a hypothesis rather than a certainty. These are the hours when the ancient monuments do their best thinking, when the silence inside them is most complete, when whatever it is that they are saying is most clearly said. Somewhere on the Salisbury Plain, the stones are standing in the dark. The trilithons that have stood since 2500 BCE are still standing, still holding the lintels, still pointing the monument's axis toward the midwinter sunset and the midsummer sunrise. They have stood through 4,500 years of British weather, through ice and drought and 10,000 autumn gales, through the ploughing up of the landscape around them and the building of roads and the coming of aircraft and the global electromagnetic noise of a world connected by radio waves and satellite signals and the constant electromagnetic chatter of modern life. None of this has moved them. None of this has changed what they are pointing at or why. They are patient in a way that nothing else in the world is patient. They are patient in the way that stone is patient, which is to say that they are beyond patience, beyond any category that has a human timescale attached to it. They simply are. They exist. They continue to exist. And in their existence, they carry the intentions of the people who placed them. Intentions we cannot fully read, but cannot entirely fail to feel. There are other ways into the ancient landscape of Britain that we have not explored tonight. Other traditions of scholarship and inquiry that have been working on these questions from different angles. Archaeoastronomy, the study of the astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient monuments, has matured significantly in the past 50 years, moving from the impressionistic claims of the 1960s, when writers like Alexander Thom were proposing that megalithic monuments encoded sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge, toward more rigorous statistical and observational analysis that can distinguish real alignments from coincidental ones. The current consensus is more conservative than Thom's original claims, but still striking. There are real alignments at many British prehistoric sites. Stonehenge's solar alignments are well established. The lunar alignments at Callanish are well established. The solar alignment at Maeshowe is well established. Many other sites show alignments that are statistically significant, that cannot be explained by coincidence, given the number of possible orientations and the specific natural events that they relate to. The people who built these monuments were tracking the sky with a precision that required sustained observation, careful record-keeping in some form, and the institutional stability to maintain that effort across many years and many generations. What is less clear, and what is likely to remain less clear, is the cosmological framework within which this astronomical knowledge was embedded. We know that the solstice was important. We know that the major lunar standstill was tracked. We know that certain stars and star groupings may have been significant in the orientation of some monuments. What we do not know is what the sky meant to these people, what stories they told about it, what relationships between celestial and terrestrial events they believed in, what the solstice sunrise through the Stonehenge axis meant in terms of the beliefs and practices of the community that had built it. The sky was a clock and a calendar and a compass. It was also certainly a story, a text in which meaning was written by powers greater than human and available to those who knew how to read it. The specific content of that story is gone, but the existence of the story is not gone. The monuments that were built around it are still telling us that there was a story there, even if they cannot tell us what it said. I want to describe to you the experience of being inside West Kennet Long Barrow on a winter morning, because I think it captures something about what these ancient places do to a person that a more detached description cannot quite convey. West Kennet is one of the best preserved long barrows in Britain, a Neolithic monument about 100 metres long, built around 3600 BCE, used for funerary purposes for perhaps 1,000 years, and then sealed with enormous blocking stones that closed off the entrance passage. Those blocking stones were removed when the barrow was excavated in the 1950s, and the monument is now open for visitors to enter, which is an extraordinary privilege, and one that most people who could take advantage of it do not. You approach from the path through the field below, walking up the gentle rise toward the long mound above you, the morning mist still lying in the lower ground. The barrow stretches away from you along the ridge, longer than it looks from below, its bulk of chalk rubble covered now with grass and brambles and a few elderberry trees. At the eastern end, the forecourt opens toward the rising sun, flanked by massive sarsen stones, and the entrance to the passage is there, low, requiring you to bend as you enter. Inside, the air changes immediately. It is cooler and damper and utterly still, with the particular stillness of an enclosed space that has been sealed for a very long time and still carries, somehow, the quality of that enclosure. The passage is about 10 metres long and lined with standing sarsen stones. The ceiling formed by enormous flat capstones that rest on the uprights, and at the end of the passage, the chamber opens out into a space, perhaps 2 metres high and 3 metres wide, with 2 side chambers opening from each side. The walls are sarsen, fitted dry. The floor is chalk. The light comes in through the entrance behind you, sufficient on a bright morning to see by, but dim enough to change the quality of your perception, to shift you slightly from the ordinary world of daylight and sound into something quieter and more interior. People have been coming into this space for 5,000 years. The Neolithic people who built it and brought their dead here. The people of the Bronze Age who visited it as an ancient monument and left offerings. The medieval people who may have used it for purposes we cannot identify. The Victorian antiquaries who came with lanterns and notebooks. The curious walkers of the 20th century. And you, now bending to enter the passage and straightening again inside the chamber. Your breathing very quiet in the enclosed space. The light from the entrance, a pale rectangle behind you, and the darkness of the innermost chambers ahead. There is nothing supernatural about this experience, or rather, it does not require anything supernatural to explain it. It is simply the effect of a very old enclosed space on a human nervous system, that evolved partly in enclosed spaces, that finds something in the particular quality of cave-like darkness and stillness and cool enclosed air that resonates with something very deep in the body's memory. But it is also, undeniably, an encounter with something made by human hands for human purposes that are not entirely recoverable. A conversation with people who wanted something specific from this space and who built it carefully enough that it has survived 5,000 years to give that something, whatever it was, to whoever comes here now. The tradition of pilgrimage in Britain, the practice of travelling to significant places as an act of devotion, is officially associated with Christianity. The great medieval pilgrim routes to Canterbury, to Walsingham, to Iona, to the shrines of local saints scattered across the country. But pilgrimage the deliberate journey to a significant place, undertaken in a spirit of something more than simple travel, is clearly older than Christianity in Britain by thousands of years. The movement of people to the great henge monuments in the Neolithic, the long journeys that brought specific stones to Stonehenge, the seasonal gatherings at places like the Ness of Brodgar and Durrington Walls, all of these represent something that the word pilgrimage describes well, even if the theology attached to them was completely different from anything that Christianity would recognize. The journey itself was meaningful, the arrival was meaningful, the performance of whatever was performed in those great circular enclosures was meaningful, and the departure, the journey home with whatever had been received or given or experienced in the sacred center, was also part of the meaning. The roads that connect the ancient monuments of Britain were pilgrimage routes before they were roads. The Ridgeway was walked by people going to Wayland's Smithy and to the Avebury complex and to the causewayed enclosures of the Chalk long before any Roman surveyor saw it and thought it useful for military logistics. The people who walked it were not making a practical journey, or not only a practical journey, they were moving through a meaningful landscape toward a meaningful destination, and the walking itself, the experience of the landscape under their feet, and the sky overhead, and the monuments visible on the ridgeline, was part of the pilgrimage, part of what was given to them by the act of going. This is not so different from what still happens in Britain today. The people who walk the Ridgeway, the people who visit Stonehenge at the solstice, the people who go to Iona on a ferry in a rainy October and sit in the ancient abbey and feel something that they cannot entirely explain, are participating in a tradition whose roots go back so far that the tradition itself is a kind of monument, a living monument maintained not in stone, but in the repeated act of going, of travelling toward something, of arriving and being changed by the arrival. In the very early morning, when the night is almost over, but the dark has not yet fully yielded to the grey that precedes the dawn, the ancient landscape of Britain is at its most present. In those hours, the modern world is quieter than at any other time, the traffic reduced to occasional vehicles on distant roads, the electric light reduced to the persistent orange glow on the horizon that tells you the town is there even when you cannot see it. In those hours, the silence is something you can almost touch, a physical presence, the same silence that the builders of the monuments knew, that anyone who has been out in the British countryside before dawn knows. The particular silence of a landscape that has not yet remembered it is inhabited. In those hours, if you are standing in the right place, if you have walked to Avebury or to the West Kennet Barrow, or to one of the lesser-known but no less ancient places that are not surrounded by car parks and visitor centres, you can feel what it might have felt like to be here 5,000 years ago. Not because nothing has changed, everything has changed, but because some things are still unchanged. The way the light comes back, the way the birds begin, first one and then another, and then many, their voices the same voices that accompanied every dawn that has ever broken over this landscape. The way the shapes of the hills emerge from the darkness, the way the chalk begins to show as the sky lightens, the way the stones stand against the coming day. In those hours, the ancient world is not so very far away. It is there in the quality of the light and the sound of the birds and the feel of the chalk under your feet. It is in the stones that are still standing where they were placed, pointing at the same horizons, holding the same angles, speaking the same silent argument to the sky. It has not gone anywhere. It is right here, beneath the centuries, patient and quiet and still present in everything that the landscape says when the modern noise is reduced to its minimum. And now, finally, genuinely, the night is ending. The darkness is not yet lifting, but the quality of it has changed. That shift that the body knows before the eyes confirm it. The sense that somewhere beyond the horizon, the decision to have a morning has been made and the execution of it has begun. You have travelled far tonight, through the deep chalk of Wiltshire and the windswept stones of Orkney, and the misty uplands of Wales and the tidal islands of the north. You have stood inside the long barrows and walked the ceremonial avenues and looked up at the trilithons against a night sky, and felt, perhaps, something of what it might have felt like to have built these things and to have believed in what their building expressed. The mystery is not solved. It never is. That is not what the mystery is for. The mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a question to be lived with, carried lightly into the ordinary days, a reminder that the world is stranger and older and more full of human meaning than it appears on the surface. The people who built these things are gone. Their names are gone. Their language is gone. Their beliefs are gone in the specific and are only present in the general sense that people who built things this way and oriented them this way and maintained them this way understood their relationship to the world in a particular way that involved the movements of the sky and the placement of the dead and the gathering of communities around the things they had made together. What is not gone is the work of their hands. The stone is still there. The chalk is still there. The grass has grown over the earthworks, but the earthworks are still there beneath the grass. The landscape is still speaking in its patient stone way, the language of a civilization that has no name and left no texts and built no cities and kept no records except these. These enormous and enduring and still partially inexplicable things placed in the landscape of Britain, with a care and a precision and an intention that 5,000 years of subsequent human activity has not erased. We are the inheritors of that landscape. Every one of us who lives in Britain or has ever visited it has walked on ground that is layered with that history, has breathed air that has blown over those stones, has been shaped, however indirectly and however unconsciously, by a tradition of inhabiting and marking and making meaningful a particular piece of the world that is older than anything else in the human story of these islands. That is worth knowing. That is worth carrying into sleep. Now rest. The monuments will be there in the morning, as they have been there every morning for 5,000 years of mornings. The stones will be standing. The chalk will be white beneath the turf. The paths will be there, worn into the landscape by more feet than can be counted, running from ancient site to ancient site along the ridges and the downlands in the way that meaningful places pull people toward them. The gravity of the sacred expressing itself in trackways and roads and the deliberate choice to go this way rather than that way, here rather than there. The civilization we cannot explain is still present in the landscape it made. It is speaking, quietly and patiently, to whoever has the stillness and the willingness to listen. You have listened tonight. That is enough. Let the stones be still now. Let the chalk be quiet. Let the hills go back to their ancient dreaming. Let the night have its last hour before the birds begin again and the light returns, and another day of this impossible, beautiful, enduring world begins. Sleep well. You are part of a very old story, on a very old island, under a very old sky. Good night. The morning is still a long way away. There is time, in these deep hours, for a little more wandering. Let the body rest, but let the mind drift, as it tends to do in the hours before sleep. Finally closes its hands around you, wandering through the old landscapes and the old questions one more time, as if the repetition were itself a kind of prayer, a circling back to what matters so that it will still be there when you wake. There is something I should have said earlier about the relationship between the ancient landscape and the modern one, something that seems obvious once you have seen it, but that takes a particular way of looking to notice. The modern landscape of Britain is not laid over the ancient one. The modern landscape is the ancient one, modified and built upon, and renamed, but not fundamentally replaced. The bones are the same bones. When you look at a map of Britain and notice that a village sits at the intersection of two roads, you are often looking at a spot that was significant long before the village was founded, long before the roads were built. The roads follow paths that followed tracks that followed the movement of animals and people across the landscape. And the village grew where people stopped, where the paths crossed, where there was water or shelter or a ford across the river, all of which are reasons that people have always stopped at those spots going back further than the village by thousands of years. The church in the village often sits within a circular churchyard, as I mentioned. The churchyard boundary, which is described in some medieval documents as ancient and in others as immemorial, follows the boundary of whatever was there before the church, which was whatever was there before that, all the way back to the Neolithic enclosure, or the Bronze Age ring ditch, or the natural topographic feature, the spring or the hill summit, or the confluence of streams, that first attracted human attention and organized human activity around itself. This is not a mystery in the sense of something hidden or encoded. It is simply the nature of how landscapes develop. People go where it makes sense to go. Things get built where it makes sense to build them. The logic of the landscape, its topography, its water, its shelter, its lines of sight, persists across time because it does not change. The chalk is where the chalk is. The spring rises where the spring rises. The ridge offers the view it offers. And people, generation after generation, respond to these features in much the same ways. Not because they are following any tradition, but because the landscape is giving them the same information it has always given. This means that the ancient landscape is never really lost. It is layered, obscured, renamed, misunderstood, but it is there beneath the modern surface, legible to those who know how to read it, present in the name of the field and the angle of the lane and the shape of the village green that was once a sacred enclosure and is now a place where people walk their dogs and children play. I want to tell you about a tradition that was still alive in some parts of Britain, within living memory, a tradition that connects directly to the ancient understanding of the landscape I have been describing tonight. It is called beating the bounds, and it is a ceremony in which the community of a parish walks the boundary of their territory, stopping at significant markers, and affirms through the act of walking that this boundary is known and recognized and maintained. Beating the bounds is officially a Christian practice, associated with Rogation Tide in the spring, the 3 days before Ascension Sunday, when prayers were traditionally said for the blessing of the crops. But the practice itself is older than Christianity in Britain, by an unknown but considerable margin. Walking the boundary of the territory, knowing it in your body by the act of traversing it, is a practice so fundamental to the human relationship with land that it is found in one form or another in virtually every pre-modern culture around the world. In the medieval and early modern forms of the ceremony, the walkers would stop at boundary markers, ancient stones or streams or trees, and the older members of the party would describe the history of each marker and what it signified for the parish boundary. Boys were sometimes bumped against the markers or thrown into the boundary stream, a practical method of ensuring that at least some of the participants would remember the location with particular vividness. What is striking about this practice, in the context of everything we have been discussing tonight, is how directly it connects to the Neolithic and Bronze Age tradition of marking the landscape. The boundary markers that the medieval parishes maintained were in many cases much older than the parishes themselves. An ancient standing stone, or a barrow, or an earthwork might serve as a parish boundary marker for centuries, its original Neolithic or Bronze Age significance entirely forgotten, but its physical presence sufficient to mark a meaningful point in the landscape and to anchor the memory of the community to that point. The ancient monuments persisted not only as objects of wonder or religious significance, but as practical markers, as landmarks in the literal sense, points fixed in the landscape that could anchor the territorial understanding of communities across many generations. They served the communities that used them without requiring those communities to know or care why they were originally built. They were simply there and their fairness was useful, and so they were maintained. And in being maintained, they survived. There is something I want to say about the academic study of these places that might seem contradictory, given how much time we have spent this evening in the realm of experience and feeling and the attempt to imaginatively inhabit the ancient past. The academic study matters. The careful, skeptical, methodologically rigorous investigation of what these monuments are, when they were built, how they were constructed, who used them, and how, is indispensable to any genuine understanding of them, and it has transformed our understanding dramatically in the past 50 years. The ancient DNA revolution alone has rewritten British prehistory in ways that would have been inconceivable a generation ago. We now know things about the people who built these monuments, about where they came from and who their descendants were, and what genetic diversity looked like in the Neolithic, that no amount of contemplative walking in ancient landscapes could ever have revealed. The non-invasive survey technologies, the LiDAR and the ground-penetrating radar, and the magnetometry, have revealed monuments that no one knew existed, have added whole chapters to a story that we thought we had substantially outlined. The careful, patient, detailed work of excavation, done properly and with full scientific rigor, gives us information about specific sites that cannot be obtained in any other way. The dating and the environmental analysis and the isotopic analysis of human remains and the study of plant remains and the analysis of ancient DNA from food residues and all the other technical procedures that constitute modern archaeological science are producing a picture of the ancient British landscape that is richer and more detailed and more surprising than anything that was available to researchers working even 20 years ago. None of this contradicts the value of the experiential approach, the value of walking these landscapes and sitting inside these chambers and feeling what the physical reality of these places does to a human body and a human mind. Both approaches are necessary. Both contribute things the other cannot. The science tells us what was built and when and by whom. The experience tells us something about why a person might have wanted to build it, what effect it was designed to have, what relationship between the human and the landscape it was meant to create and maintain. Together, they bring us as close as we are currently able to get to an understanding of a civilization that left no texts, no names, no stories that we can directly access. Only these extraordinary physical achievements and the landscape in which they sit, and the sky to which they point, and the earth from which they were made. There is one more thing I want to tell you, one more discovery that I have been saving for the end, because it seems to me to encapsulate something important about what the ancient landscape of Britain ultimately is and what it continues to offer us. In 2021, archaeologists announced the results of an analysis of the cremated human remains that have been found in the Aubrey holes at Stonehenge, the circular series of pits that represent the earliest phase of the monument's construction. The analysis used a technique that can determine the isotopic signature of cremated bone, identifying where a person spent the last years of their life from the chemical record preserved even after cremation. The results were striking. Many of the people whose cremated remains were deposited in the Aubrey holes during the earliest phase of Stonehenge's construction had spent the years before their death in Wales, not in Wiltshire. They had lived, or at least spent significant time, in or near the Preseli Hills from which the bluestones were quarried. This is an extraordinary finding, because it suggests that the connection between Stonehenge and Wales was not simply the connection of quarrying and transport, not simply the physical movement of stones from one place to another. It was a human connection. People from Wales, or people who had significant ties to Wales, were being cremated and brought to Stonehenge and buried there in the period when the monument was first being created. The stones and the people moved together, or approximately together, the physical and the human elements of a single project. What this implies about the social organization of the people who built Stonehenge, about the relationships between communities in Wales and communities in Wiltshire, about the nature of what Stonehenge was and who it belonged to and who it was for, is something that researchers are still working out. But it is a reminder that the great monuments of prehistoric Britain were not built by anonymous abstract communities. They were built by specific people, people who had lives and relationships and histories, people who came from somewhere and went somewhere and were mourned when they died and carried to their burial place by others who cared about them. The cremated remains in the Aubrey holes are not just evidence of a ritual practice. They are the remains of people. People who saw the bluestones being quarried in the Preseli Hills, perhaps, or who participated in the long journey that brought them to Salisbury Plain, or who were the spiritual authorities whose presence at the new monument was considered essential. So essential that when they died, their ashes had to be there, at the beginning of something that would continue long after them and eventually, after 4,500 years, would still be standing in the same field, still pointing at the same horizons, still asking the same questions of the same sky. The sky is beginning, very slowly, to change, not to lighten yet, but to shift in some imperceptible way, a settling of the deepest dark before the first loosening of it, the way the night moves just before it begins to give way. You may feel it, or you may already be too close to sleep to notice. Either way it is happening, as it has happened every night since there were nights. The ancient mechanism of the world turning and the sun returning, as reliable as the stones that were built to mark its coming. In a few hours, the sun will rise. Over Stonehenge, it will rise approximately over the heelstone, as it does every morning. The alignment that was built into the monument, not just for the summer solstice, but for every day. The axis of the site pointing toward the northeast, where the sun appears above the horizon in the cold grey of the pre-dawn. Every morning, for 4,500 years, the sun has done this, has risen approximately over the heelstone and sent its early light down the axis of the monument and illuminated whatever has been illuminated there. Snow and grass and archaeological surveys and the faces of solstice visitors and the ancient sarsen, stone itself, receiving the light it was placed to receive. This will happen tomorrow morning, as it happened this morning, as it will happen 10,000 mornings from now. The stone is patient, the sun is reliable, the alignment was built to last, and it has lasted, and it will continue to last long after everyone who is currently alive has returned to the earth from which they came. There is something enormously comforting about this, once you let it settle. The world is doing its thing. The ancient machinery of the solar system is operating with its usual precision. The stones are where they were placed by people who understood something important about where to place them. The landscape is holding everything it has always held. Nothing fundamental has changed, or nothing so fundamental that it could not survive. You are part of this. You are one small element in a very large and very old story, and you are alive in it, right now, in this moment, in this night, breathing in the same air that has been breathed by every person who has ever lived in Britain, the same air that blew through the Sarsen trilithons when they were first raised, that carried the sound of whatever was spoken then, that has been moving across this island without interruption for every year of its long inhabited history. You belong here, in this moment, and the moment, as all moments do, belongs to everything that has come before it, and everything that will come after. Rest now. I mean it this time. The stones are standing. The chalk is cool and white in the earth. The ancient paths are lying quietly under the modern roads, waiting. The barrows are sealed with their old knowledge. The henges are holding their circles against the returning day. You have listened well tonight. You have been patient with the old stories and the slow telling of them. You have travelled across a landscape that is stranger and older and more extraordinary than any simple telling can capture, and you have brought to it the patience and the openness that these places deserve. Tomorrow there will be more to discover. There always is. The ancient landscape of Britain is not a finished text. It is an ongoing conversation between the people who first made it and the people who still live in it and on it and around it, between the chalk and the stone and the sky and the long, patient, endless process of trying to understand what it all means and who we are in relation to it. But tonight, the conversation is over for now. The night is giving way to morning. The dark is giving way to grey. The stillness is about to be broken by birds. Sleep well. The old world is still here. It will be here when you wake. Something else before the morning fully comes. Something about the nature of mystery itself, and what it means to live in a landscape full of things you cannot explain. We have spent a great deal of time tonight in the presence of the inexplicable. Not the supernatural, or at least not necessarily the supernatural, but the genuinely unexplained. The things that exist in the archaeological record without a sufficient account of why they exist or what they were for. The enormous pits near Durrington walls. The painted geometric patterns in the buildings at the Ness of Brodgar. The upturned tree stump at Stonehenge. The consistent orientation of recumbent stone circles toward the southern sky and the lunar standstill. The movement of specific stones from specific quarries across enormous distances. The depositing of specific people in specific monuments at the beginning of those monuments' construction. These things are not explained. They are documented, dated, analyzed, and placed in their archaeological context. But the explanation, the account of why this happened, rather than something else, is not available to us. The people who knew are gone. The tradition that understood what it was doing is gone. What remains is the physical record, eloquent and mute, capable of telling us that these things happened, but not capable of telling us why. And this is the condition in which we actually live, not just in relation to ancient monuments, but in relation to most of the history of the human species on this planet. We know that things happened. We have varying degrees of evidence for what happened, but the inner life of the past, the beliefs and the feelings and the reasons and the meanings, is almost entirely inaccessible to us. We are surrounded by the consequences of decisions we cannot recover, shaped by events we cannot fully understand, living in a world that was made by people whose inner lives are as opaque to us as our own inner lives will be to people 5,000 years from now. This is humbling. It is also, I think, beautiful, because it means that the world is larger than our understanding of it. It means that the past is not a simple, known, closed thing that we can survey from our vantage point in the present and fully comprehend. It is deep and dark and full of things we cannot see clearly. It is as full of mystery as the night sky, as full of wonder as the first time you stand inside a Neolithic chamber and feel the weight of the earth above you and understand in your body that this was made by human hands 5,000 years ago for reasons you will never entirely know. The mystery is not a failure. The mystery is the truth. We are small, and the world is large, and the past is very long, and the things that human beings have thought and felt and built and believed across the enormity of historical time are so much more than we can ever fully comprehend. The honest response to this is not frustration, but wonder. And wonder, properly cultivated, is one of the most valuable things a human being can carry through their days. The ancient landscape of Britain is a teacher of wonder. Stand beside the Calais stones on a grey Atlantic morning and you cannot help but wonder. Stand inside West Kennet and you cannot help but wonder. Look at the sweep of the Avebury earthworks from the bank, and you cannot help but wonder. This is not sentiment. This is the accurate response to encountering something that exceeds your capacity to explain it. Something that was made by minds working in frameworks you cannot fully reconstruct. Something that has survived for so long that the survival itself is a kind of statement about the durability of human intention. Wonder is what brought us here tonight. Wonder is what keeps the archaeologists digging, and the researchers analysing, and the walkers walking, and the people who come to Stonehenge for the solstice sunrise year after year, in rain and cold and the uncertain early light, standing in the ancient circle and waiting for the sun. Wonder is what you feel, even now, even half asleep, carrying the images of the standing stones and the long barrows and the chalk-cut figures through the last few minutes of wakefulness before sleep finally takes you. The wonder is still there, even in the dark, even in the silence, even when the words have stopped. That wonder belongs to you. It is one of the oldest things a human being can feel. The builders of these monuments felt it, looking at the stars, looking at the hills, looking at the work of their own hands, rising out of the chalk landscape, understanding that they had made something, that they had changed the world, that the mark of their minds would be legible in the earth long after they were gone. They were right, it is. Now sleep, really sleep this time. The ancient world has said everything it needs to say for one night. The stones are standing in the dark, pointing at the horizons they have always pointed at, holding the angles they were built to hold. The chalk is down there beneath the turf, cool and patient and enduring, the white bones of the landscape lying quiet in the earth. Somewhere in the darkness, the ridgeway runs along the chalk ridge as it has always run, empty and silver in the moonlight, the paths of 10,000 years of walkers worn into the turf as gently as the trace of a remembered touch. The barrows rise along the ridge in their slow procession, dome after dome against the pale sky, each one a conversation between the living and the dead that was had thousands of years ago and has not yet ended. The sea is there at the edges of the island as it has always been, the same sea that brought the Neolithic farmers and carried the bluestones along the coast and washed over Doggerland as the ice melted, the same sea that is still rising, slowly, as it always has, the same sea that connects this island to everywhere else, that makes it an island and also makes it a part of something larger than itself. And above all of it, the sky is turning. The stars are moving through their ancient courses. The same stars that the builders of Callanish tracked with such patient attention. The same stars that rose over the Ness of Brodgar when the great ceremonial centre was alive with fire and voices and the sound of cattle and the smell of feast fires. The same stars that were there before any of the monuments and will be there after the last of them has worn away to a slight irregularity in the ground. The ancient landscape is part of the sky, the way it has always been. The monuments were built to connect the earth to the sky, the human to the cosmic, the lived moment to the endless turning of everything. They are still making that connection. You are inside it now, in the dark, in the silence, in the space between waking and sleep, where the body has let go and the mind is just beginning to drift. Go where the drift takes you. The ancient world will be here in the morning. You are part of a very old story. Sleep. Good night. There is one more thing. Just one more, and then we are done. In the year 1723, a man named William Stukely sat at the edge of the Avebury earthworks with his notebook and his pen, and drew what he saw. He was not the first person to record Avebury, but he was the first to understand its full extent, the first to walk the avenues and trace them for miles, the first to sit at the junction of the Kennet Avenue and the Beckhampton Avenue and understand that the Great Circle was not a single isolated monument, but the centre of a designed landscape. He spent years at Avebury. He came back again and again, in different seasons and different weathers, and each time he looked, he saw more. What Stukely understood, sitting in a field in Wiltshire in the early 18th century, with his pen and his notebook, was something that took the rest of the archaeological world another 2 centuries to fully appreciate. He understood that the ancient landscape was not a collection of objects. It was a composition. It had been designed not in the way that a building is designed by a single architect with a single plan, but in the way that a conversation is designed by many participants over a long period, each one responding to what came before and adding something of their own, the whole accumulating into something that no single designer could have conceived or intended, but that emerged from the accumulated intentions of many people over many generations. This is what the ancient landscape of Britain is. A conversation in stone and earth and chalk that has been going on for 6,000 years and has not yet ended, because we are still part of it, still responding to what came before, still adding our own marks to the landscape, still being shaped by the places and the history and the long, patient, astonishing achievement of the civilization we cannot explain. You are part of this conversation. You are in it right now, in this moment, carrying the images of the ancient landscape through the last few breaths before sleep takes you. The conversation will continue when you wake, as it has continued every morning for 6,000 years of mornings. But for now, for these last few minutes of this particular night, let it be quiet. Let the stones be stones, let the chalk be chalk. Let the ancient world rest, as it has rested through every night that has ever fallen over this island, patient and complete, and full of things we have not yet found the words for. You are one of us. You have always been one of us. Every person who has ever stood in the chalk landscape and felt something they could not name. Every person who has ever put their hand on an ancient stone and felt the time in it. Every person who has ever looked at a barrow on a hillside and wondered who is inside it and what they believed and what they loved and what they feared. You are one of that long, long line of people. The stones are your inheritance. The chalk is your inheritance. The mystery is your inheritance. Take it with you into sleep. Good night. And yet, one final thought, rising up before the silence finally takes hold. In the museum at Salisbury, in a glass case under careful lighting, there is a small object made of shale. It was found in a Bronze Age burial on Salisbury Plain, near Stonehenge, and it dates to around 2000 BCE. It is a button, or rather, it is what we would call a button, though the people who made it and wore it would not have had that word. It is a small disc of polished shale with a perforation through it, and it was probably sewn onto a garment and worn as decoration, as a fastening, as an expression of care about appearance and presentation that is so fundamentally human that 4,000 years have done nothing to make it strange. Someone made this. Someone sat down with a piece of shale and shaped it and smoothed it and pierced it and sewed it onto their clothing because they wanted to look a certain way, because they cared about how they appeared to other people, because they had something that we recognize instantly as vanity, as self-presentation, as the universal human desire to be seen and seen well. That person also lived in the shadow of Stonehenge. They knew its stones, perhaps helped maintain them, perhaps participated in whatever was still happening there in 2000 BCE. They watched the same sunrise and set that Stonehenge was aligned to track. They walked on the same chalk, breathed the same air, saw the same stars. They were part of the same world that made the trilithons and the avenues and the barrow cemeteries and all the rest of it. And they also cared about their buttons. This is the ancient world. Not only the vast and mysterious and architecturally astonishing, also the small and human and recognizable. Also the desire to be seen. Also the care taken over the details. Also the shale disc polished smooth by patient hands and sewn onto a garment that is now long gone, leaving only the button in the glass case and the 4,000 years between us, which are long and dark and full of lost things, but not quite long enough to make the button incomprehensible. We understand the button, and through the button, just barely, just for a moment, we almost understand everything else. That is the gift the ancient landscape gives us. Not answers, Not certainty, not the complete picture. Just occasionally, in the right light and the right silence, the feeling of almost understanding, of almost touching across the enormous distance of time, the hand that made this thing and wore it and eventually carried it into whatever came after. Almost. That is enough for tonight. Sleep now. Truly. Finally. Completely. The ancient world is patient. It will still be there when you need it. The stones are standing. The chalk is quiet. The morning is coming, as it always comes, as it has always come, over the same hills and the same barrows and the same circles of stone that were placed to greet it 4,000 years before you were born. You are part of something very old and very beautiful and very mysterious. Let that be your last thought as the night ends and the sleep comes and the ancient landscape waits in the dark outside for the sun to find it again. Good night. The wind is still moving through the stones at Avebury, as it always has, carrying nothing but air and the memory of everything that has happened in that ancient space. It moves through stone and chalk and grass and out into the dark where you are. Quiet now, breathing slowly, drifting into the oldest human thing there ever was. Sleep.